Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I stopped at the overlook because the road had been a grind and I needed to stretch my legs. I'd been driving all afternoon from Reno up into the Sierras, the sort of weekend escape that starts with a playlist, a thermos, and the idea that being alone in the mountains is somehow the reset you don't get in town. It was late October. The first real cold had set in, and there was a thin dusting of snow on the ridges. The air at the pullout tasted like metal and pine. My dashcam had been a dumb impulse buy from Amazon. Cheap, adhesive mount, 1080p, picked up because I liked the idea of having a record of the drive. I'd got it mostly, so my insurance couldn't deny me if someone hit me on a back road. It sat there on the windshield like a little black eye. I'd glanced at it a couple times while I was getting coffee out of the thermos, making sure it had power and the little red light was steady. There had been weird, small things before the thing over the ridge. First, the radio cut out for a full minute on a stretch where it never had before. Static, then dead. My phone showed a full bar and then zero, and then full again, like it had hiccuped. The cluster lights dimmed twice for maybe 2 seconds each. Not a full power loss, just a shudder where the dashboard went half dark and came back. Little stuff you chalk up to old wiring and mountain roads. I sat on the bumper and pulled my jacket tighter. The overlook looked down a valley rim where you could see the next ridge over and the highway curling off into a canyon. The sky was clear, stars starting to prick through purple dusk. There were no lights on the opposite ridge, just the pale wash of snow and dark trees. A hawk or something had been circling earlier, but it had gone. Even the normal background noise, distant traffic, a dog from a house below, was gone. It felt like the world had taken a breath and held it. I walked back to the car because I wanted to warm my hands and check the dashcam footage. I fumbled with the little button to power it on and held my phone up to it to make sure the timestamp matched my watch. It did, 8:13 p.m. I put the thermos in the cup holder and watched the screen out of some nervous habit. That's when I saw it, a static white dot just above the ridgeline, maybe 5 miles away as the crow flies, hovering. It wasn't twinkly like a star, and it wasn't streaking like a plane. It was a small, sharp point of light, steady as a nailhead. For a second, I thought it was a headlamp on a helicopter, except it didn't move, didn't dip, didn't throw a beam, just sat there like someone had planted a flashlight in the air and left it on. I watched it for a minute, and the feeling of being watched came back, that tightness behind my sternum. My hand went to my phone, and I held it out of the window to get a closer look. The camera's autofocus hunting on the dim point made it just look like a bright pixel. I sat down, and the engine idled, low and even. The hawk shadowed the ridge somewhere unseen, a motion out of the corner of my eye. A minute passed. Then the light moved, not down the ridge or across it, but sideways in a short, clean arc. It wasn't the random drift of a satellite. It was smooth, intentional. The light slid left, stopped, slid right. I say those words because they were all I could think to say out loud to fill the space. I felt like I was watching a child on a string toy, not something at altitude. When I replayed the dashcam footage later, I found out I'd been wrong about the time sequence of that first movement. But standing there, I only knew the movement as I saw it. Slow, precise, nothing like any aircraft I'd seen. I took the thermos back inside the car and hit record on my phone. The camera captured the light but looked awful, grainy, blown-out pixelation where the point of light saturated the sensor. I zoomed in on the dash cam. The built-in date stamp on the corner read 2013-47. The video was smooth, as if filmed from a mount. The light sat above the ridge until 2014-10, slid left, held, slid right, and then stopped. That's exactly when a group of small things happened at once and layered over each other like notes in a chord. My phone alarm, which I hadn't set, chimed once in that tinny, half-annoyed way. The car's clock on the dash blinked 2021 for a single frame and then returned to 21 till 14. My breath caught in my throat in the way it does when someone walks into the room you thought you were alone in. The hawk cried once, far below, a wet little keening. I watched the light hold. It didn't blink out. It didn't bank away. It just sat like a punctuation mark over the ridge. I drove on because my head was full of small gears clanking. I wanted to get down the mountain before the road iced, and I wanted cell service to call someone and sound normal about it. The highway wound back down, and the radio came in and out like a nervous friend. I kept stealing glances in the rearview mirror. The light stayed in roughly the same place relative to the ridge, drifting the tiniest amount like a boat on a huge, invisible current. I rolled into the first gas station town and pulled into the lot. The neon signs hummed in the dark, and I told myself I'd only be 5 minutes. I turned the car off, opened the door, and felt how cold the world had become. The breath haze in front of me looked wrong for the temperature. Too thick, moving like smoke. I told myself to stop acting like a character in a movie. Back at my laptop that night, after coffee and a cigarette on the hood, I uploaded the dash cam footage onto my phone and watched the segment over and over. The video file was fine. The motion, the arcs, the perched light, all there, even the sound of my thermos lid clicking in the background. But when I played the footage, the timestamp behaved oddly. The dashcam's embedded stamp read 2047 at the start. The light appears. At the moment, the light slides right, a motion that takes about 3 seconds. The timestamp advances not 3 seconds, but 7 minutes, jumping from 2014-16s with no visual cut. Frame by frame, there's no missing footage. The video continues playing exactly where it left off. The light still hovers, the ridge remains the ridge, my own hood ornament reflected in the lower corner. The image doesn't skip, the soundtrack doesn't skip. The only thing that changes is the stamped time in the corner, like the camera secretly decided it lived in a different minute. I watched it several times, thinking I'd misread the numbers until my eyes hurt from squinting. I slowed it down to 1 frame per second. The stamp leaped exactly 7 minutes forward in the middle of the light's tiny horizontal crawl. Then it kept going. I checked the file metadata. The file creation time matched when I'd uploaded it. The dashcam clock was set to local time. There was nothing in the properties that explained a 7-minute jump. I plugged the dashcam into another machine, swapped memory cards, tried different players. Same result, smooth footage, timestamp skipped. I told a friend, Jess, who works nights in a hospital and believes in weird things only as a way to avoid being scared by them, and she asked if I'd checked the dashcam firmware. I thought I had, but I updated it anyway. No effect. I took the SD card out and looked at it under a loop. No fingerprints, nothing. It was warm when I removed it, oddly warm long after I'd been sitting with my hands in mittens in the cold. After that night, the small anomalies stayed with me like thistles. My car's clock would be a minute or two off for a day at a time. My phone would drop calls exactly when I'd be about to describe the moment I'd seen the light, and then reconnect a few minutes later with no missed call log. At work, someone would ask if I was sleeping okay, and I would tell them yes, because you always say yes. But I'd think about the stamped jump, the way that single digital number could be wrong, while the rest of the world kept humming the same tune. A few weeks later, my buddy Rob and I drove back up to the overlook at dawn because I needed to see the ridge in daylight. We parked and stood looking. The place looked ordinary, all scrub and snow and the thin strip of highway like a sewn seam down a coat. We found a small patch of pine sap on the shoulder where my thermos must have rested. There were no prints other than ours. No scorch on the brush. Nothing burned. The only odd thing was that some of the sap was grayish instead of amber. I scraped a sliver into a jar with my pocket knife, more because I couldn't think what else to do. Rob asked me why I was still circling it. I didn't have a good answer. The honest one, that a timestamp had skipped 7 minutes while the camera showed nothing missing, sounded ridiculous even to me. He shook his head and said maybe it was low battery, and then laughed like that made it all fine. I drove home that day, slower than usual, watching the horizon as if I'd missed something obvious. The light never reappeared. The dashcam continued to record, dutiful and mute, dutifully stamping minute after minute across the corner of the footage. Sometimes I watch the clip again in the dark, frame by frame, like that's where an explanation might be hiding. Sometimes I compare the phone's clock to the cars, the ovens, any clock. They mismatch sometimes, in small ways, nothing enormous, nothing you can point a finger at and say that was it. Occasionally, when I'm alone in the car at night and the world feels like a single long ribbon of black, I catch myself checking the rear view. Not for other cars, but for something else. For a dot where it shouldn't be, for a slow, perfect arc. I don't have a theory. I have an awkward humming patch of footage and a number that leaped forward 7 minutes with no cut. And I have the sense that something about the night was patient enough not to break its rhythm just because I noticed. I keep the original file backed up in 3 places. Sometimes I think I should send it to someone who studies oddities, or to a forum where people trade timestamps like currency. Other times, I think it's exactly the sort of thing that would get you labeled as the guy who saw a light once and couldn't let it go. So, I drive when I can, keep the dash cam clicked on, and I try to measure the minutes when I can. If anything else unusual shows up one day, a second camera warm in my hands, or a light that doesn't move like a plane, I'll photograph it, stamp it, and watch the numbers like they're a confession. For now, there's just that one file and the knowledge that whatever hung above that ridge, it was patient enough to let my cheap camera record it without changing the film, and clever enough to move time in a way only a tiny digital number would notice. It started with the porch light failing. I remember that because I was standing on the steps rinsing out a glass jar watching the last of the sunset fade behind the maples. It was late July and the front yard smelled like cut grass and the neighbor's barbecue. My phone said 9:13 p.m. The light over my door blinked once, twice, and then everything beyond the porch went dark in a way that felt immediate. Not a gradual dim, but a clean cigarette burn cut to night. For a second, I thought it was just my bulb. Then the house across the street went black, then the whole row. The streetlights clicked off like they'd been switched. The engine noise from the highway thinned until it was nothing. My phone's screen brightened in my hand because it was the only light for a block. I set the jar in the sink and walked to the driveway. The power outage was neighborhood-wide. Cars coasted to the curb, headlights cutting short arcs, then turning off too. Someone down the block turned on a flashlight. The beam looked small and industrious in the dark. Kids came running out of their houses, pajamas flapping, and their parents, blinking in the doorway, wore cerulean faces like people who'd been woken up by bad news. We all did the same thing after the first stunned minute. We stepped into the street. It was the most American kind of thing, I guess. Everyone out in the road in slippers, looking up and at each other. Mrs. Delgado from next door held a candle under the awning because she'd seen it in a movie once. Ethan from 3 houses down had his skateboard under one arm and his phone held like a talisman. There was no sound of sirens, no dispatchers on the scanner someone had brought out, just a gathering of voices clipped by sleep and curiosity. The odd little things piled up before anything major happened. My digital clock on the oven reset to 12:00, like the circuit had tripped. My instant coffee maker, the one with the tiny display, showed gibberish until I banged on it, and it went blank. My phone dropped from 3 bars to nothing for a few seconds, then came back with a single text from my sister that said, "Are you seeing this?" And then a string of question marks. Dogs began to bark all at once in a low, urgent way. Not the playful yips, but that deep, pointed barking that makes you look over your shoulder. A dozen dogs somewhere down the block howled once like a choir. We stood there in a loose ring, lanterns and candles and phone screens making little islands of light, and the sky above was impossibly vast. No airplane trails, no orange haze from the city. The Milky Way was a slab of milk, thick and detailed, more stars than I remembered seeing since I was a kid. It felt like we'd been handed fresh, raw night. Then it moved. At first, I thought it was a plane stuttering, because there was a triangle of sky that went dark for a half second and then bright again. But then it slid, very slowly, like someone dragging a ruler across a sheet of paper. The patch of darker sky maintained a triangular outline, edges crisp against the stars, but it wasn't a shadow from a cloud. The stars were gone where it passed. They simply vanished, as if someone had peeled back a tiny piece of the heavens and put a black card in its place. People said things then. What the hell? Is that a weather balloon? And the words broke on their way out because no one could make a theory that fit what we were seeing. Ethan raised his phone and tried to film. The screen showed the triangle at first. Then when he zoomed in, it turned to a smear of gray, like the camera couldn't decide what to do with it. He swore and pointed. The band of darkness moved a hair to the left. There was no sound, no hum, no distant engine, not even the high whine of a chopper. The dogs barked, then fell silent. The quarter moon hung to the side of the triangle like an offended spectator. The shape moved with a slow, methodical grace, the tip leading, the base trailing, crossing from one side of the sky to the other in a way that made everyone's necks ache. I remember thinking about light meters and exposure and the way a camera tries to interpret a scene. A few people kept trying to photograph it. On every phone, the result was the same. If the camera exposed for the stars, the triangle was absolute black, no detail. If it exposed for the triangle, the stars around it burned out into snow. The analog cameras, the old manual on Mrs. Delgado's shelf that someone brought out with trembling hands, showed a negative like someone had scratched the emulsion. It didn't look like anything anyone had seen before. The neighborhood collectively held its breath. The triangle kept moving, and with it the patch of missing stars tracked across Orion and past the Pleiades. When it moved over the gas station's sign, the red neon flickered and held, as if it were suddenly rethinking color. The street lamps, the ones that had gone out with the rest of the grid, stayed dark. If there had been any sound at all, it might have been the soft rustle of someone shifting on grass, the sound of shoes on asphalt when someone paced and went back to looking up. At one point, as the triangle passed over the far oak and then the river beyond, the sky around it bent very slightly. Not like heat haze, there was no heat. More like the stars near the leading edge stretched a little toward the form, as if gravity was a hand tugging at pinpricks of light. I noticed it and said it out loud, and two other people echoed it at once. Then, a minute later, a humming note arrived under everything. It was faint and steady, like a tuning fork somewhere in the ground. It made the wineglass in my hand quiver. The sound didn't come from the triangle. It arrived at the same time from multiple directions, like it belonged to the whole neighborhood. When the humming started, a man on the corner, I had seen him at the mailboxes earlier. He had a name tag that said Paul, turned on his truck radio because habit, and the radio answered with a thin band of static that fell into the same pitch as the hum. He shut it off right away and laid a hand on the hood, looking as small as the rest of us. The triangle kept moving, exactly the width of 2 or 3 constellations at once, and the space it occupied was darker than anything I'd ever seen. Not a deeper black, but an absence. If I squinted, I could see the outline of it, and the edges had a sort of soft halo under close inspection, like the night had been cut, and the cut rim glowed a touch. I thought about birds. Where had they gone? The birds had abandoned the sky. The neighborhood quiet was not empty. It was thick with the sense that something had rearranged how we were supposed to measure up to the world. For how long, I don't know. My phone read different from all the wall clocks. The oven was still at 12. Someone's wristwatch had jumped ahead 5 minutes and then back. Time felt elastic in that ring of people on the street, stretched and held and maybe even measured against the triangle's slow drift. Then, it passed over the river and the air seemed to snap like a rubber band releasing. The stars popped back into place, not perfectly as if someone had to repin them in the sky, and the humming died. Dogs barked at once, relief or protest, I couldn't tell. A car down the road started up with a jerk and headlights carved out bright rectangles. One by one, the home's lights blinked back on as the grid re-engaged. The street lamps buzzed and warmed uranium gold. The oven clock resparked, and Glenn from across the street laughed a little too loudly and said something about needing a drink. We all stood in the warm light, as if someone had turned a page for us. People drifted back toward their houses with thin, private smiles and 100 questions. Mrs. Delgado hugged herself and then walked slowly, like she'd been holding a secret and decided to keep it. Ethan replayed his shaky video and showed us the smear, and then scrolled to the next clip, where the triangle was gone and a flock of birds had returned to scatter like confetti. I walked home along the sidewalk under the now familiar porch lights and felt a ridiculous urge to check the sky again like I'd missed a cue. The night looked like any other except brighter, as if our seeing had sharpened something in us. I unlocked the door, and something tiny and domestic waited to anchor me. The smell of coffee from the next house over, the faint clink of someone washing dishes. I put the jar on the counter and turned the light on in the kitchen, and its bulb hummed normally. Before I went to bed, I looked out the back window one more time. The house at the end of the block had a motion light that clicked when a raccoon passed through, and under the streetlight, the grass looked ordinary and flat. There was no trace of the triangle left in the sky, no missing stars, nothing on the weather app but a small note about a temporary outage due to a local grid event. My phone had about 1 bar of service. I thumbed a message to my sister that said, simply, "You saw it too, right?" She responded with a laughing emoji and then, "Yes, don't be weird." In bed, the ceiling fan hummed a comfortable, steady note that made the house sound like itself. I lay there and tried to name what I'd seen with ordinary words. Triangle, silhouette, darker than the night. I tried assembling facts into sentences and then tossed them aside because they felt like bandages on a cut that hadn't healed. The neighborhood slept the way neighborhoods always do. Windows dark, slow breathing behind curtains. But my skin felt like a ledger, ledgered with small, unaccounted for things. Morning came, and with it the small, mundane proof that the world still kept its order. The garbage truck, the mail carrier, a neighbor's dog dragging a leash. People told the story in bright, efficient bits over coffee while standing on driveways. A post popped up on the neighborhood website with 3 shaky videos and 20 comments. The power company called to say crews had found nothing wrong with lines. The mayor's office issued a curt statement about an unexplained visual anomaly and advised people not to speculate. Everyone laughed over that sentence until the laugh soured and we put our hands in our pockets. I went to work, and my coworkers asked me how my weekend was and if I'd seen the lights. I said yes, and kept the rest small, the way you do when you've watched something that fits no section of your neat life. At lunch, I stepped outside and looked up. The sky was clear and normal, a shorthand blue. I took pictures of it like a joke, like proof that clouds obey the day. They did. At night, since then, I drive a little slower through my neighborhood. I stop at the corner and look up at the same patch of sky where the triangle slid, or at least where I remembered it. Sometimes I see a plane, an honest contrail. Sometimes there's nothing at all. The stars are there, big and patient. The memory of that black triangular cut across them sits in me like a note whose melody I can't finish. I don't have a neat ending for it. I only have the streetlight glow, the dog's sudden chorus, and the way the whole neighborhood gathered out in slippers to look up and try to make sense together. I launched the drone because the light was doing that stupid, perfect thing right before sunset. The kind of soft, oily gold that makes cliffs look like they belong in a travel brochure. I'd driven up the coast alone, like I did when I needed to not think about emails and bills. The place was a little cove north of Mendocino, a stretch of rock and scrub you have to hike down to if you want it all to yourself. The wind was low, the ocean was flat enough to mirror the sky, and I set the controller on my knee and pushed the sticks. The drone was in Mavic Air 2. Nothing exotic, but good enough that the footage usually looked nicer than anything I shot with my phone. I prepped it the usual way. Prop checks, GPS lock, battery to 90%. The signal bars on the controller showed strong. I remember thinking how nice it would be to get a wide sweep of the cove, the cliffs, the foam, how small a person looked walking that shoreline. I clipped the prop guard on out of habit, even though I never used it on open water, because there's a comfort in ritual. At first, everything was normal. The drone lifted, snapped into position a little above the cliff lip, and I eased it forward along the coast. The camera feed was buttery. You could see the wet sheen on the rocks, the dark tongue of kelp drifting like a slow shadow. I dipped the drone lower to get the surf lines and a little patch of sand that looked like a pale thumbprint. The colors were insane, blues that weren't on my monitors. Then something small and stupid happened that I didn't think to write down at the time. The compass warning popped up. I'd seen it before in parking lots when a car radio was loud, a warning that vanished if you moved 10 feet. I nudged the drone sideways and the warning cleared. I shrugged and kept going. A minute later, the birds went quiet. There were always birds along that stretch, gulls looping and terns darting over the water. They'd been around since I walked down from the parking area, noisy and messy like they owned the place. But as the drone banked over the cove, they fell into a hush. I mean, full stop, wings folded, a few coasting in a wider arc, but the noise just stopped. I noticed it like you notice background music cut in a movie. You only realize how loud it was when it's gone. At the same time, the controller beeped, signal lost. It was a flat, clear warning. The screen froze on the live feed for a heartbeat. The altitude readout hung at 280 feet. And then the telemetry continued, but the image turned into a smear of static for maybe half a second. The controller tried to relink, the little icon pulsed, and then the feed popped back as if nothing had happened. That would have been fine. Drones lose signal all the time and come back. But the world felt different in that tiny slice of time. Air pressure or my imagination, I don't know. I should have brought it straight back then. Instead, I pushed it another few hundred feet out to get the whole bay in frame. The camera was sharp. The kelp looked like a dark braid. I eased a little higher to give myself more margin, watching the beach for anyone, thinking about how nice the footage would look on a slow second-day edit. That's when the screen went black again, and this time the controller gave me the return to home countdown automatically. RTH engaged, it said, and then the telemetry froze at 360:21. The controller still showed bars, and the GPS map rendered the drone's white dot out where I'd sent it. But the live image was gone. I panned the camera with the wheel and got nothing. Just a gray fuzz where the ocean should be. I thumbed the control, waved my arms like I was signaling an idiot on an airstrip. Nothing. The controller kept beeping like an insistence, but the bird didn't obey. I ran down the path toward the shoreline, controller in hand, because the automated return hadn't kicked in the way it should. The drone was out beyond the kelp line, farther than I usually pushed. As I crested the last dune, the wind hit. A small gust off the sea that made my eyes water, and I could see the surface. For a few seconds, my brain tried to explain everything. Maybe it had been a flare, a wake from a fishing boat. Then I remembered the feed had gone dark and tried to locate it with my eyes instead of the screen. Search patterns are dumb when your hands are shaking. I moved along the waterline, scanning the horizon inch by inch. The sun lowered itself like a coin, slipping into velvet. I called out the drone's name like it might answer. Nothing. I hiked back up after 20 minutes, chest aching, thinking I'd just lost a stupid little machine to the ocean. The controller recorded last telemetry at 3616:21, and then nothing, as if the unit had stopped logging. I sat on a ragged rock and told myself I wasn't the first person to lose a drone. People in forums lost them all the time, to gulls, to salt spray, to software. I texted Sophie, my sister, who's a marine tech, a brief, bitter joke about buying a new one. Sophie replied with a short emoji and suggested I check tide charts before I started fishing around. I laughed at myself and did, and realized the tide was definitely heading out. If the drone had fallen into shallow kelp beds, it might have beached on a rock now. That made me feel better enough to go looking at low tide. I walked the black sand and the slick rocks until my ankles got wet. Then, about 40 minutes after I'd first lost the signal, something caught in the kelp and the white shell of the drone bobbed up. It was tangled, one prop snapped, one arm gouged, but it was there. The little orange case streaked with seaweed. I dragged it up onto flat rock and sat down hard. The drone's chassis was warm, oddly warm, like it had sat near a heater. I popped the SD card out with numb fingers and waited for it to dry a minute before sliding it into my phone adapter. The video file opened, and the first frame made me laugh. Grainy ocean, the drone's own shadow over a patch of gray water. I scrolled forward to when I remembered the feed dying. At 03614, the footage was normal. The drone drifted on its station, the camera showing kelp and foam. Then, between 3:20 and 22, the image below the drone cut to a texture I can't name at speed. It was dark and moving, not like a boat wake or a school of fish. It wasn't water. For one frame, the whole screen filled with an almost matte black, like someone had dropped a wide piece of cloth over the lens from beneath. Then, in the next second, the camera recorded something passing underneath that blocked the entire ground. Not a shadow from above, but something with mass and edges, moving headlong across the frame. You can tell when footage is fake, when it's composited. This didn't have that uncanny flattening. The way the light wrapped and fell around it, the way small bubbles and foam clung to the edges for a fraction of a second, the refraction at the margins. All of it read like something real and wet and impossibly large had moved between the lens and the world. I scrubbed through the clip a dozen times until my thumb cramped. The object filled the frame for about a second. Then the image stabilized on open water again, and the drone jostled like a bird had passed too close. There was no roar, no sound picked up by the microphone except the faint hiss of wind. The timestamp jumped. I noticed only later, a single frame glitch in the embedded log where the camera stamped 0321 and then 321 in the very next frame. The file's external metadata showed continuous recording, no edit. But the name of the last frame before the black fill had been followed by exactly 7 minutes in the stamp. I called Sophie and left a short message. I didn't know what to say. We met at a diner later because that felt less insane than talking in my car with kelp-scent hands. I showed her the footage on my phone. She watched quiet, face getting that serious look she gets when she's trying to fit a weird sensor trace into something explainable. Could be a whale? She said, because that's what you say when you reach for rational anchors. Big humpbacks can cast weird shadows if the sun's low, or a fishing trawler's net. She paused, watching the screen. But it shouldn't match the physics on the edge like that. That looks like it was right up against the lens. I'd thought of whales and trawlers. I'd thought of cargo ships with cranes, of rogue seaweed mats. None of those matched the way the frame filled and the abrupt digital timestamp hiccuped by 7 minutes. Sophie suggested I send the raw file to a few friends with more videotech sense. I did. A couple said like compression artifacts. One said it looked like a lens smear until he slowed it and saw the edges. None of them volunteered much beyond curiosity. People asked after the footage online and on local Facebook pages. Some joked about alien manta rays. A fisherman told me about a time-off bodega when the sea turned wrong for a minute after a storm. The harbor master said nothing. The county marine lab asked if they could have the drone. I let them borrow it for a week. They ran it through their equipment and returned the case, whispering about salt crystals and nothing that made sense. Their lead tech was more Kerstu. He handed me the ID card in a little anti-static sleeve like it was fragile glass. I still have the clip on my hard drive. I watch it sometimes at night when the house is too quiet and the tide's high and you can hear water at the bluff. The object's edges in the frame look like a skin of shadow with irregularities, folds maybe or ridges, but every time I slow it down, I'm left with the same vague, sinking feeling that it's too composed to be natural and too unadorned to be purposely made. The 7-minute stamp glitch is a thing I can reproduce on screen if I freeze and step frame, but it never explains itself. I kept the battered drone partly because it cost money, partly because I couldn't bear the idea of throwing it away, like whatever had happened could be dismissed. If anything else about that night is true, it's this. I launched a little machine into an ordinary sky, and for a breath it saw something enormous and quiet pass beneath it, something that didn't bother to make noise or waves the way I expected, and then the footage returned to making surf look lovely again. I went home, I made coffee, I upload the file now and then, watch the spot where the black comes in, and then I stop. I drive the coast sometimes at dusk, hands on the wheel, watching for anything that might throw a shadow big enough to fill the frame. Mostly I just keep the file and tell myself I was there to see it, which is a hard thing to prove and an easier thing not to admit. I drove out to my grandmother's place because the forecast said the shower would be good. Perseids peak around midnight, the kind of thing you go see if you grew up without streetlights. Her farm sits 4 miles down a gravel road right outside of York, Nebraska, a patch of sky big enough to swallow whatever falls through it. I took my old lawn chair, a thermos of coffee, and my dad's binoculars, because he'd always said binoculars catch more streaks than a telescope. My friend Lila came out with me. She's the kind of person who packs extra sweaters and a battery lantern and a bag of weird jerky she swears by. We set up behind the old corn crib where the ground dips and the horizon cuts clean. The air was hot and dry, the smell of cut alfalfa thick. Crickets filled the field in that steady, comfortable way they do at dusk. A tractor hummed somewhere in the distance, and the occasional dog barked down the lane. We were both half distracted by conversation, complaining about work, about nothing, when the first oddness happened. The farmhouse lights across the road went out. Not the slow dim of a failed bulb, but a clean shut. Mr. Hargrove's porch light blinked, then the whole house turned black like someone had closed a lid. A second later, the distant highway lights went too, and the world lost that orange haze you always forget is there. "It's the grid," Lila said, frowning. "Or a storm, maybe." But the sky was clear, and the radar on my phone, when it bothered to load, showed nothing. My phone had 2 bars and then none. Lila's showed the same. We laughed at that, standing in the dark with our phones like weird little beacons, and told each other, of course, everything would fail the minute I brought a thermos of coffee. The first meteors came like any decent show, quick white lines tearing through the black. We counted 3 nice ones in the first 10 minutes and got that stupid little thrill you get when something you expect actually happens. Then the animals stopped, not gradually. The crickets, the frogs, every night noise cut out like a switch. The silence hit so sudden I could hear my own breathing. Somewhere a rooster slept into nothing. We both looked at one another, stupid smiles freezing. "Okay," Lila said, not a joke this time. "That's weird." We sat without talking for a beat, half afraid to break the quiet. Then the second odd thing. A light showed up where no meteor should be. Not streaking. Static, like a distant lamp hung in the sky. It was faint, a soft white dot higher than the corn crib and out past the trees. At first, I thought it was a plane's navigation light fooling me, but it didn't blink, and planes have the sound you can hear on a night like that. This thing made no sound. We watched as another point of light appeared, and another, a ring of pinpricks that hovered above the tree line. They weren't bright. If you weren't looking directly at them, you might mistake them for stars. But their behavior wasn't stellar. When one came on, another nearby would dim. They tilted faintly, as if testing a position. It was slow, like a clock someone wound carefully. I tried to film it with my phone. The footage looked dumb on replay. Little dots against 2 black sky. When I zoomed in, the camera's image fuzzed and then auto-corrected to the wrong exposure, and the dots turned into smears. Lila's binoculars were better. Through them, the first 3 lights had a faint blue tint, like an LED you could hold between thumb and finger. I told myself 100 rational things. That someone had a drone party, that a bloke was shining a laser from the silo, that we were tired and the sky was playing tricks. Then the lights didn't streak anymore. They hovered. Every meteor we'd expected to see as streaks were staying in place, a cluster now. Little beacons like a constellation someone was rearranging midair. Before the big movement, other small wrongs piled up. My watch, a cheap digital thing I wear and forget, blinked forward a minute and then back. The thermos lid squeaked when I unscrewed it like metal under pressure. Lila's hair stood up at the nape of her neck, like a static charge that had no wind to cause it. Dogs across the road started barking in a long communal chorus, then stopped. The farm's radio, the one that usually sits on static on the kitchen bench, chattered once with a single tone and then cut. Everything felt slightly out of sync, as if the night had picked a new tempo and we hadn't been given the sheet music. The lights began to rearrange. It took time, which made it worse. One would go dark and another, 5 degrees clockwise, would brighten until there was a perceptible line of motion. The formation grew deliberate, 4, then 6 lights coalescing into straight edges, the space between them exact, geometry you don't get by accident. They moved with the precision of people carrying a frame through fog. not the messy randomness of meteors. Lila said, "Do you see that?" Like she hoped I'd say something clever. I did the math in my head because you always do that with things you can't name. If those lights were 10 miles out, this was a calculation that made no sense. If they were close, their size would be enormous. I tossed the numbers away because numbers didn't make the hush any less heavy. As they settled, they formed a shape, a rough hexagon, edges defined by the faint dots. The interior was empty sky, but the edges were crisp and measured. For a few moments, we were actually watching a polygon hang over the corn, as casual and as impossible as a billboard in the clouds. The air changed. You could feel it. Not a breeze, but a pressure, like standing at the mouth of a cavern when someone else breathes in. My eardrums gave a soft pressure pop, and I tasted metal at the back of my throat. Lila's flashlight flickered, then steadied to a dull red glow. Her phone chimed a meaningless series of characters, and then nothing. Then, one by one, the lights winked out. Not all at once, but with a rhythm that matched the hush, folding inward like someone turning down lamps in a theater. The hexagon dissolved into pinpricks, and each pinprick blinked away until the sky was pure again. Stars, indifferent and countless. The crickets came back as if someone had flipped them on. The distant highway returned in a warm smear of engine. The perfect ordinary noises of the prairie soaked into the field, and we were left blinking at the blank night. We sat there for a long time, not speaking, listening to the ordinary reassert itself. Lila swore she saw movement inside the hex before the lights went. A shimmer, a darker place like heat over asphalt, but I couldn't tell. My camera's footage, when I finally dared to look, showed a cluster of white dots, and then a glitch frame where everything washed out, like the sensor compensated for glare. The file's timestamp hopped 3 minutes forward between two frames. I stared at those numbers until my eyes hurt. We packed it up slow. The gravel on the lane sounded enormous in the dark as we slid the chairs into the trunk. Mrs. Hargrove's pickup rolled down the lane with its lights back on. He gave us a wave that looked like a question. At the gate, Lila hesitated and said, "I don't know what to do with that." I told her the sensible thing. We should go home, drink coffee, pretend the world wasn't rearranging itself. And she laughed, a small, tight sound, and agreed. On the drive back into town, I kept glancing up, as if the sky might still be rearranging while I wasn't looking. It didn't. The strip mall lights had none of the solemnity of the field. People sat on porches and said the usual smalls. My phone found signal at the edge of town, and a dozen missed messages arrived from people asking if we'd seen the meteor shower. Lila texted a photo she'd taken before the geometry completed. A dark screen with a few pinpricks and the caption, "It stayed." That night, I lay awake a long time thinking about all the small wrongs that had stacked up to make the big one possible. Odd electronic hiccups, animals stopping, lights failing in a neighborhood-wide sweep, the strange pressure in the air. Those were the breadcrumbs. The hexagon felt like the only obvious thing, the one shape a human mind could settle on and say, "Yes, that is something." But even as I named it in my head, I knew that naming was not solving. The sky had done something it doesn't do. It had paused and rearranged itself like a hand sort through cards. In the morning, the county paper had a single paragraph about unusual sightings, quotes from a farmer who thought the lights were some kind of lens flare. The University Astronomy Club posted a video that showed a smear and some static and then nothing definite, and other people were arguing in the comments, which is how the internet handles everything important. Lila and I compared notes that day at a diner and kept finding small mismatches. The times we'd written down differed by seconds, our photos had different glitches, and both our watches had lost and gained minutes in ways we couldn't explain. I went back to the crib a week later during the day and found the ground trod down where we'd sat. The stalks were bent in a neat radiating pattern, not crushed but pressed, like something heavy had rested there for a while and then left. I took a picture, and it looked like any field picture until I zoomed in and there was a faint, almost metallic dust in a patch that clung to the leaf. I wiped it with a glove and brought the glove home in a Ziploc because that, at least, felt like keeping evidence. I don't have a tidy ending for it. I don't have an explanation for why the meteors didn't streak or why the lights would hold and then step into geometry and wink out. All I have are the small chain of wrong things that led up to it. The silence, the phone bars dying, the watch stuttering, and the memory of a hexagon hanging over the corn like a hole cut in the sky. Sometimes at night I still look up, waiting to see if the stars will decide to move again. Mostly they don't. They keep being stars and we keep making lists. But every so often I catch myself checking my phone time or pausing when the animals go quiet. Like I'm listening for the first wrong note that would let me know the sky was thinking of rearranging once more. It was 2 in the morning when I noticed the figure in the kitchen window. I was making tea because I couldn't sleep, small, practical ritual, and the house was the kind of quiet that made the refrigerator sound too loud. The sky was the glossy black you get in winter, and there was a thin rain that had stopped about an hour earlier and left the world smelling like cold concrete. My kitchen faces the backyard. Beyond that is an alley, and then the backs of other houses. I'd lived in this place long enough to know every ordinary shadow at that hour, so when something moved in the glass, it made my mouth go dry. At first, it was just a smudge, a darker smudge against the dim reflection of my island light. Then the shape traced a gesture, one slow, deliberate arc like someone pushing back a sleeve. Not a full silhouette, not a person you could identify, just the suggestion of shoulders and a head, a vertical presence that matched no tree branch. The movement was a fraction out of phase with my own. I lifted the kettle to my cheek to warm my hands and watched it. The figure moved when I didn't, and when I thought about the shape as a reflection, there was a wrongness to it. It seemed to have depth behind the glass rather than on the same plane as the kitchen. I opened the blinds on the sliding door because the only honest thing to do was look. The backyard puddled under the deck. The oak's leaves beaded with water, and a trash can leaned a little farther into the alley than usual. There was nothing moving. No person, no cat, no raccoon, just the slow mist and a porch light throbbing like a heartbeat. When I closed the blinds again, the figure remained for a moment exactly where it had been in the glass. It felt like a smear the world could keep even when the real thing had gone. Then it dissolved, softly back into the ordinary reflection of my oven light. I stood there for a long time doing what you do, making up explanations. Headlights, catching a curtain, someone on a ladder outside a neighbor's house, my own shadow doubled. My phone lay face down on the counter and I flipped it to check the time. 2:07, and texted Liza, my friend who worked nights, not because I wanted company, but because it's easier to say a small, ordinary thing to someone who answers when your brain feels much larger than the room. Her reply came back in a minute. Go to bed, Nate. She always kept things short. I poured the tea and noticed the clock over the stove flick. It jumped from 2:09 to 2:14 and then steadied. I laughed a little at that. Cheap digital clocks do that when the power dips. The oven display blipped too, all zeros for a heartbeat. The house didn't lose lights. Everything stayed on. But there was a thin metallic ringing in my teeth, barely audible, like the hum you hear in old hospital rooms. I told myself not to make a thing out of electrical gremlins and thought about how stupid I was for standing at the window at that hour. The next oddity was Scout, the neighbor's golden, who sleeps half his life under my kitchen window like he owns the yard. He was inside his own house that night. I'd heard him earlier when Liza let him in for the night. But when I walked to the sink, he started to bark once. A long, single bark that was half alarm and half question. I froze, and the sound didn't repeat. The curtains at the neighbor's kitchen twitched. They always did when someone moved inside, but it was a tiny twitch like a breath. I opened the blinds again and looked straight into the backyard with the porch light throwing a yellow smear along the wet boards. Still nothing out there. I took a photo of the window with the phone because that's what people do now. Proof, data, something to show. The image was a grainy square of my island light and a darker obscurity where the figure had been. But when I zoomed, the file was overexposed in that area and gave me nothing useful. The pixels would resolve to nothing but a fuzz, like the camera had politely refused to record. I swiped the phone off and set it face down again because staring at a screen at that hour makes the mind run tangents. Around 2:25, the street outside snapped to life like someone had lit a match. A car door banged, a bike squeaked by, and a neighbor's porch light came on with the annoyed stutter those bulbs have when the wiring is old. People scream and retire to their beds, I thought. Someone else is awake, which made me feel marginally safer, the way sharing weirdness dilutes its weight. I took a pull of my tea and felt ridiculous for being on edge. Then there was the knock on the back door. Not the quick, polite rattle of a package delivery. This was 3 slow, measured knocks, hardly louder than a tap. I looked over my shoulder at the sound, and my heart did a little confusing flip. The back door has 2 locks and a chain, and the porch light outside spills its thin halo across the deck. I had already seen no one outside. The scene was familiar in a way that made the knock feel like a mise-en-scène. I checked the chain and the deadbolt and stood with the door slightly ajar and the blinds creased at my back. No footsteps, no one knocking again, only the regular distant sound of rain slapping gutters and a dog somewhere down the block revving into a bark and then calming. Maybe a neighbor had mistaken my house for theirs. Maybe someone was drunk. Maybe the wind had thrown a branch against the wood in such a rhythm that it counted as knocking. My mouth tasted like pennies. I called out, "Hello," and got only the echo of my own voice. After 10 minutes and 3 more single knocks that arrived like a metronome, 1 pause, 1 pause, I went out on the porch with my teacup like armor. The cold bit through the robe and my slippers left soft prints on the mat. I peered around the yard and down the alley. The trash can was tipped the same way as before. The air smelled of wet leaves and oil from cars. Nothing was there. No footprints, no flashlight beam, no person leaning against the neighbor's fence. When I stood still, the knocking didn't repeat. It felt deliberate and gone all at once. The rest of the night narrowed to small checks. I walked the perimeter of the house in my socks, and the gravel crunch felt loud in the quiet. The security camera over the garage recorded the expected blob of streetlight and nothing else at 2:32. The timestamp crisp and mechanical. On the playback, there was a brief shimmer, 3 frames of a darker smear that the software smoothed into noise when you sped the clip up. Alone, scrutinized, it resolved into nothing helpful. I made myself a list-like set of things that could explain all of it. Faulty wiring, an animal, an overworked neighbor, my own tired mind. The rational list kept expanding, to cover the uncomfortable fact that the window had showed me motion that wasn't there and the door had been knocked as if by someone polite who didn't want to announce themselves. You build explanations because the world insists on being answerable, and we like the relief of being right. Finally, around 3, I went to bed, but not before I did the small human things you do when the night feels like it could tilt. I double-checked the locks, I set the kettle within reach, and I left the kitchen light on. I slept in fits with one eye open to the clock. Once I dreamed that someone stood at the window and mouthed my name, but the letters were wrong and tasted like metal. I woke and blinked at the ceiling, and the house was ordinary in the way houses become ordinary when you remember to breathe. In the morning, the world was the kind of mundane that feels almost obscene after a night like that. Kids waiting for the school bus, the neighbor with his paper, the mail carrier who makes a point to whistle when he reaches our porch. I checked the outside of the sliding door for prints and found nothing beyond the expected smears of rain. Scout lay at his kitchen mat and wagged when I knocked on the wall between our houses. Liza came by with 2 mugs because, of course, she did. "You texted me weird," she said, smiling like the serious business of nighttime texts had become a joke we could agree on. She asked whether the camera recorded anything. I let her look at the last clip and we replayed it a few times. The software showed the window as a black square and 3 frames of static where there might have been a shape. For whatever reason, those 3 frames refused to resolve into a person, only noise, as if the night had decided not to be captured. Later, over coffee, she said something practical, I suppose, to steady both of us. Sometimes there are echoes of things. Reflections catch someone in the neighbor's yard, or a passing car makes a pattern that looks like movement. I thought of that often over the next week. because that's how you live when something small and unexplained has brushed you. You test normality until it fits again. A Monday later, I found an old photograph in a box in the attic. It was of this house when that maple was a sapling, the kids on the block playing in the yard. The edges of the photo were worn and the glass had a hairline crack. When the sun hit it just so, the reflection inside the framed image showed a smudge in the same exact place I'd seen the figure, a darker suggestion where a head might be. I couldn't explain why a photograph taken decades ago would behave like that, but I wrapped the frame back in its paper and put it under the bed like a small private relic. I took apart the kitchen clock and found the little capacitor swollen and replaced it. The oven received a technician's visit and its circuits tested fine. The house felt, in the end, like itself again. Fixtures fixed, devices behaving. And yet, something in me remained alert in the way a person stays alert after a loud noise, more attentive to small sounds, to the way shadows settle. A month later, a friend told me about a similar thing at her aunt's place upstate, a reflection that didn't match any person, and a single knock that showed on camera and then failed to show. She laughed about it like we laugh about the weather. We both knew those laughs were a way to keep our feet. I keep the blinds halfway open now when I make tea in the middle of the night. It's less about watching the yard and more about watching myself watch it. Sometimes the window will throw back a smear when the light catches it just right, and I'll stop and look, and sometimes I won't see anything at all. The house hums, the clocks keep time, and life moves through days that insist on predictability. If the figure ever comes back, I will do what I did before. Look, confirm, call someone if I have to, drip tea on the counter, and try to rehearse the things that made sense. For now, the one certain detail is this. When the blinds are wide and the glass is dark, the world gives you a hint of something that looks like a presence, and you have to decide whether to name it or keep it unnamed. I left the kettle on the stove for a while after that night, the little blue light like a heartbeat, and in the mornings I make a point of seeing the house light up again, small domestic demonstrations that the ordinary can return, even if it has to be asked politely. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, one of those short, sharp vibrations that wakes you without the guilt of the full alarm. I blinked up at the ceiling and saw it was 2:11 a.m. The text preview said only, "Go outside. Look west." Maya's name on my screen was enough to make me put my feet on the floor. She's the sort of friend who texts like she's telling you a small, urgent secret, never the long explanations at 1 a.m, just the imperative. I grabbed my robe, shoved my feet into slippers, and padded to the back door. Outside, the air hit me hard and cold. It had been a warm day, but the night slipped sharp as knives. The backyard lights were off. I didn't expect anything. Maya lives 2 blocks over, and she doesn't bother watching the sky at ungodly hours. The west was a deep black behind the line of oaks that runs along the edge of our neighborhood. No stars because the tree line ate them. For a second, I thought she was joking. Then I saw it, a single red point of light, steady as a laser, hanging right above the tree line. Not blinking, just there, perfectly round, and the kind of red you don't see from an airplane. Too thin, like an LED you could hold between your fingers. It was maybe the size of a thumbnail at arm's length. My first thought was a drone, except there was no drone sound, no whirring, no breeze. The night felt too still to hold the idea of rotors. I texted back, "Where are you?" while still squinting. Her reply came almost immediately. "At the corner. It's been there 10 min. It's getting closer." I stayed on the porch even though every sensible thing in me said go back inside. The light didn't change for a beat, then seemed to resolve, like when you stop trying to read a smudge on glass and suddenly it becomes a word. I blinked, because blinking is basic human reflex and a way to stall, and when my eyes opened, the light was subtly closer. Closer enough that the space between the tree trunks that framed it made it look like it was sitting in the branches now, instead of above them. I checked the back door handle with the side of my hand, half expecting to find it warm. It was cool. The sound of the neighborhood was wrong in ways I'd notice after. The distant highway that usually thrummed like some steady creature was a thin hiss. The frogs that used to be loud this time of year were silent. A dog barked twice somewhere to the east, and then not again. You don't fully register those absences until something else happens. The porch light flickered. Not the bulb. The whole fixture flicked like someone had blinked a switch, once and again, then steadied. My phone slid down to no bars for a second, then jumped back. I thought of calling the non-emergency line, of calling Maya's number, but the thought of moving away from the light felt like surrendering a vantage point. I wanted to keep looking. It drifted closer in still small steps, not the skitter of a drone, but the confidence of a thing that knows its path. Each time it moved, it seemed to slide between trunks as if finding a hole in the canopy to fit through. At one point, it was low enough I could see a faint halo around it where the leaves caught color and dropped back to green lightless. The red itself didn't spread. It just sat in the center like a bead of lacquer. Maya came up on my porch a minute later, her jog clothes on, hair wrapped in a messy bun, eyes wide and breath visible from the cold. She didn't say hello. She only held up her phone for a second like a talisman and mouthed, "Closer, right?" I nodded. She stepped up to the rail and wrapped her hands around it like someone holding onto a boat. She told me later she'd walked out just to see if I was awake. There's a neighborly absurdity in that. Two adults at 2 a.m, gauging light across a line of trees like watchmen. We stood there in companionable silence while the thing kept nearing. Nothing else in the yard moved. A moth hit the kitchen window with a soft, wet thud. That was all. I tried the cheap zoom on my phone. The image came up grainy, the red resolved to a small circle with a faint inner dot that suggested depth, like it had a center and a shell. The audio picked up nothing beyond the soft rustle of leaves not being moved. Even the sound absentness felt too measured. I hit record because against better judgment I wanted evidence. Even now, I don't know why. Maybe because I wanted to prove to myself that I had not been hallucinating. When you watch something unnatural get closer, your brain does a weird inventory of the familiar. If that's a drone, I can hear the rotors. If it's a lantern someone's walking, I can see their motion. None of that fit. This red light moved with neither animal haste nor mechanical clumsy. It slid with a deliberation that was the opposite of panic, the kind of calm that makes your skin crawl. At one point, the light hovered low enough that I could have thrown a soft toss and hit the branch it hovered over. I blinked, an involuntary reflex blink, and when I opened my eyes, it was closer again. Not dramatically, not an enormous leap. The kind of move you only notice when you blink, like a chess piece slid under your nose when you weren't looking. The hair on my arms pulled up. Maya saw it too. She breathed out a laugh that held no humor, more a noise of disbelief. "It blinked," she said. "When I closed my eyes, it was here." I rationalized, as human beings do, that our perceptions were playing cruel tricks because of the cold and the lack of sleep. We argued in a whisper about whether to wake her husband, whether to call 911, whether one should call 911 for a suspicious light in the trees. We opted for caution and called him anyway. He answered, voice thick and half asleep, and agreed to come look. While we waited, the neighborhood did that single curious thing people do. Neighbors emerged, one in flannel, one with a flashlight, another barefoot in a robe. There were 5 of us now, a small audience on a long, narrow stage of a street. Someone joked about aliens, and the laugh came out too sharp. Everyone's phone camera failed to convey the exactness of the red. On screen, it was more like a smear, a blotchy postage stamp of crimson against black. Ethan, the guy from 2 doors down, climbed onto his truck bed to get a better angle and slipped a quarter turn on the top of his boot. He swore under his breath. When he steadied himself, the light had shifted again, closer to the line of houses. That's when the sense in the group changed. What had been curiosity rippled into something like awareness. We had moved from watchers to noticed. Maya's husband pulled into the street in his robe with a flashlight and a baseball cap. He got out and stood with his hands in his pockets. He didn't have a long speech. Nobody did. We stood together and watched one small red dot move from branch to branch like someone walking a wire. A car rolled slowly past down the road and the driver slowed, craned his neck, then went on, eyes wide. The light didn't flinch. Then the dogs started. A chorus from a dozen yards down started a staccato set of yelps and then silence. The red light dipped and went behind the dense part of the trees, and for a moment we saw nothing. I blinked. mechanical now, a reflex I couldn't shake, and when my eyes cleared, it was farther down the row, almost at the house line, the red getting brighter and more resolved, like some small reality had accreted into being as it descended. Past that point, logic and self-preservation are thin. I was alone that weekend, camping near Loch Lomond in late October. The weather was typical for that time of year, cold, damp, and fog rolling in off the water in waves. I had chosen a small clearing near the northern shore, just far enough from the main parking area to feel like I had some privacy. My plan was simple: set up the tent, make a fire, and spend the night reading and listening to the loch. By the time I finished setting up, it was past 8 and the fog had thickened. The loch was almost invisible beyond the tree line, the water itself a flat, dark sheet that reflected nothing. I had the fire going, kettle on the edge of the stones, and I was leaning back in my folding chair when I noticed the lights. At first, I thought it was someone else camping on the opposite shore. 2 small, bright white dots, almost like headlamps, bobbing slightly. But as I watched, the dots didn't move toward me or each other, they stayed in the same place. They were definitely human-sized, standing upright. The more I looked, the more certain I became. 2 men, dark suits, standing perfectly still, just beyond the water where there was no path, no road, no dock. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was seeing reflections or something in the fog, but when I looked again, they were still there. The wind picked up, pushing the fog around them, making their shapes appear and disappear like shadows in a thick curtain. I couldn't make out faces, just the outline of their bodies, tall, rigid, unnatural in their stillness. I tried to ignore them, told myself I must be imagining things. I poured some water into my kettle and leaned back, staring at the fire. But I couldn't stop sneaking glances. An hour passed. Then 2. They didn't move. They didn't speak. Nothing changed except the fog rolling heavier over the water and the fire crackling lower. At one point, I thought I saw one of them shift slightly, but it might have been the fog again. I considered calling out, but it felt wrong. Like speaking would break some unspoken rule. I didn't feel fear in the traditional sense, more like an awareness that I was being observed and that my presence mattered in a way I didn't understand. Around 3 in the morning, the fog was so thick that I could barely see the shoreline. The figures were still there. My fire had almost died out. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping it across the loch. The beam barely reached the opposite shore, but when it did, the men were gone. Not hidden by fog, they weren't there at all. I stood up, shivering, trying to see if they had slipped back into the trees. Nothing. The water was empty, flat, still. I sat back down, too tense to sleep, until I heard a sound. Leaves crunching, faint but steady, coming from the tree line along the water. I froze. The sound grew slowly, deliberate, and then 2 figures appeared from the trees where no path led. They didn't run. They didn't speak. They just walked upright, straight toward a point a few hundred yards away, then vanished behind another line of trees. I could see their silhouettes against the fog, black suits blending into the night. There were no footprints, no evidence they had walked through the undergrowth. By the time dawn broke, the fog lifted enough for me to inspect the ground where they'd been standing. Nothing. No crushed grass, no mud prints, not even broken twigs. The area was as untouched as the rest of the clearing. I packed up slowly, half expecting them to reappear, half expecting someone else to come across me in the mist. Nothing happened. Driving back to my flat in Glasgow later that morning, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see a black car or figures following me along the A82. I passed the same stretch of loch without seeing a thing. By the time I was back in the city, the experience felt like a dream, or like it was something I was meant to forget, if not entirely. I tried talking to friends about it, but most dismissed it. Probably other campers, or fog plays tricks on you. But I know what I saw. I know they weren't just other campers. I camp often, usually alone, and I've never seen anyone appear or disappear like that. Weeks later, I returned to the loch, this time in daylight, and retraced my route to the clearing. The shoreline was empty. The trees were the same. There was nothing to suggest that anyone had been there at all. I never saw the figures again. I haven't seen anyone in a black suit since, and I haven't returned to that campsite at night. But sometimes Driving along the A82 after work, when the light hits the water in a certain way, I catch a shadow or a flicker in the corner of my eye, and I swear I see them, standing at the edge of the loch, still watching. I've tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe it was another camper, some prank, a trick of the fog and my own imagination. But the way they appeared, the way they disappeared, the fact that no path or boat could have brought them there, it doesn't make sense. I don't know what they were doing or why they were watching me, but I do know one thing. Whatever it was, they had been waiting. And somehow I had stumbled into their observation. I tell the story only now because it's been years, and it stayed with me, tucked into the back of my mind where I can't quite reach it. Some nights I still picture them out there, black shapes in the fog, patient and motionless, waiting for someone else to notice. Even writing this, I check the windows, half expecting to see them on the far shore, standing silently, staring back. I hadn't planned on staying out late. I went down to Blue Water Lake because Mason's kid had his baseball game canceled and he couldn't get off work to go, and I needed the quiet. I've been going to that little cove for years with a Coleman lantern, a cheap rod that never catches much, and an old aluminum skiff that leaks in one spot if I don't bail it. It's not a complicated ritual. Set out at dusk, sit, watch the dark come in over the trees, listen to the water, and keep the problems of the week small by comparison. That night was warm and humid, the kind of heat that makes the air feel slow. The highway a few miles away hummed faintly through the trees, but once you're 100 yards off the boat ramp, it blurs into a background drone you hardly notice. I pushed the skiff out myself because Mason wasn't there to help. There was a thin mist rising off the surface as I rowed toward the center of the cove. I joked to myself about being a cliché, old man in a boat, cheap rod, the whole routine, but it was exactly what I wanted. Nothing to think about except how my bobber sat in the water. I set the lantern on the stern and clipped the fishing light to the pole. It's not bright, just enough to see the line and a little circle of water. The sky over the lake was clear, a few scattered clouds to the west and a thicket of stars overhead. Everything was ordinary for nearly an hour. Frogs called from the cattails, a heron materialized and stalked along the far bank, and once a raccoon nosed the shore like a late-night prowler and then disappeared. The skiff creaked and I hummed off-key to the radio that I'd tuned in before I left the ramp. Country station, weak but steady. I didn't expect much from the night and got exactly what I wanted. The first odd thing happened around 10:30. The frogs stopped. It wasn't a gradual quieting. One moment they were doing their usual chorus, the next, the sound cut off as if someone had snapped a switch. The silence was loud enough that I heard the chain on the anchor clink against metal. I looked up, and the sky was the same. The moon had sunk lower, but the stars were sharp. I told myself the frogs had gone to sleep, or that a predator had worked the bank, but there was no movement along the reeds. That little unnatural quiet sat with me. I trailed my hand in the water to keep from thinking too much. The surface was glassy where my hand passed through it. A faint warmth rose off the water, like you get after a hot day when the surface keeps clinging to heat. The radio sputtered and then cleared. The song stuttered for a beat and resumed at the right place, which was the kind of mundane little glitch you expect with a weak signal. I laughed at that one, because it's easier to laugh than to feel the hair rise along the back of your neck. A second odd detail, the insects. Usually on nights like that, the air is thick with moths and gnats, especially at the edge of the lantern light. That night, there were almost none. I saw the occasional moth flap by the lantern, a lazily looping silhouette, but the cloud of tiny winged things that usually hangs just off the surface of the water never showed. It felt like someone had swept the air clean. I baited the hook with a nightcrawler and threw the line out. Nothing. The bobber sat there, patient, while crickets from the distant bank resumed a soft rustle. I watched the capillaries of currents by the reeds as a breeze feathered them. Then, without any sound at all, a band of white light came down through the sky and struck the surface of the lake maybe 30 yards from me. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen. I'm not good at technical optical descriptions. My first thought was beam, because you immediately think that way. But It wasn't a spotlight from a plane or a flashlight on a pole. There was no source I could see. The white column appeared to fall out of the sky and pierce the water like a knife. Where it hit, the lake lit up from within, as if the water itself had become a shallow, unblinking star. Tiny something, fish perhaps, jerked away from the column, a ripple of motion, and I was sure for a heartbeat I heard the soft slap of something moving below the surface. But that could have been my own breathing feeding me an idea. There was no sound, no motor, no mechanical hiss, nothing. The radio didn't change, the heron on the far bank didn't startle, and the night felt wrapped in a bubble where only the light existed. The column lasted maybe 2 or 3 seconds. I counted them, because that's what you do when your brain wants numbers and facts, as if counting might anchor the moment to sanity. Then the white light folded up on itself and vanished. The water went dull again. The frogs remained silent. My first reaction was practical disbelief. Maybe someone down on the far shore had a flashlight and some angle that made it look like the beam came from the sky. But I had the whole arc of the trees between me and any shore, and the angle didn't line up with anything human-made I could imagine. I scanned the horizon, no flash, no plane, no helicopter, just the usual traitorous light from the highway way off in the distance. After the beam faded, a thin mist seemed to thicken for a minute, hugging the surface. It smelled like the lake itself. Wet algae and old bark, not that metallic smell some people say accompanies strange lights. I sat very still because moving felt like the wrong thing to do. What if my motion broke whatever thread of reality had made that column? The radio hummed its way through a commercial. Somewhere far off, a dog started to bark. A deep, honest noise that made the silence feel normal again. I reeled in the line and checked the hook. Clean. No bite marks. Nothing on it. I snapped photos with my phone because it's muscle memory now. When something strange happens, you take a picture, even if you don't expect it to show anything useful. The screen showed what I remembered. A patch of glassy water where the beam had been, and nothing in the photo but the lantern's ring of light. The images didn't capture the column. That disappointed me in a minor, childish way. It also made the event feel private, as if it had been arranged for me alone, and cameras were politely excluded. I thought about calling Mason, but what do you say? Hey, you free to come out? A light came down and poked the water. So I did what men with boats and nothing else to do often do. I drank cheap thermos coffee and tried to talk myself down. I rowed toward the spot at a slow, deliberate pace, each stroke careful so I wouldn't make waves. As I approached the place, the water had flashed. The surface looked colder. A skin of chill glossed across it. The frayed grass at the edge of the cove was still, no wave, no disturbance, no floating debris, nothing. The oars dipped and the boat barely moved. Another small thing happened then, one of those details that sticks in your head, oddest later. The fish that sometimes break the surface, the bass that slurp flies when the light's right, they didn't. For those last few minutes, the lake behaved like a pond that's held its breath. No fish, no bugs, no frogs. The world had tightened in on a single event and then loosened again, leaving a pocket of emptiness. I pulled the skiff back toward the ramp and motored slowly, testing the old outboard because I didn't want it to fail with the dock still a ways off. It sounded normal enough, a tired cough and a steady beat. When I tied up and carried my gear up the slope, the town lights beyond the trees looked the same as always. Steady, indifferent. The dog from the neighbor's yard was quiet. The highway was its distant, mole-hilled hum. I didn't tell anyone that night. I drove home with the windows down because the air felt fresher than it had when I left, and the fan on the dash didn't rattle like it usually does when it's been off for a while. I went to bed at midnight and lay there replaying the beam in my head until sleep took what was left of my attention. In the morning, the lake was a talking thing again. Cars in the parking lot, kids at the ramp, froth of ordinary life. I thought about mentioning it to the man at the bait shop. He's the kind of guy who hears everything and sorts it into categories, and I wanted that sorting. I realized I didn't want it sorted. Part of me liked holding the thing private, a small unshared oddness that made the water feel less like a commodity and more like a place with edges. It's been a couple of weeks. I still go out some nights when I can. The frogs have been a little thin where they used to be loud, and once I noticed, a week after, An odd ring of bubbles clustered where the beam had hit. They disappeared by morning. Mason asked if I'd caught anything. I told him the honest answer, no, but I'd seen something beautiful and strange, and I didn't know whether to square it away with explanation or keep it as a plain, private, not quite anecdote. I sleep fine most nights now. I keep the boat at the ramp, the lantern in the corner of the garage, and the thermos where I can reach it. I don't expect any more lights to come down. If they do, I'll row out and watch, because at some point I decided I prefer the uneasy truth of a thing seen to the tidy nothing of a thing omitted. For now, the lake is back to being just a lake, and I'm content with how impossibly small and solid that is. I woke up because Roxy was snarling at the window. That doesn't sound like much until you hear the kind of low, sustained growl she makes when there's a raccoon on the trash or when some idiot sets off fireworks too close to bedtime. I rolled over and fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, the screen a dull blue. It was 2:06 a.m. The bedroom was pitch dark except for the tiny glow from the stove clock in the kitchen down the hall. Roxy's growl kept going, deep and single note, and she wasn't moving her body much. She was a heavy dog, mostly asleep through the night, but she was fixed on the window like something had her full attention. I pulled the curtains aside and looked out. There were figures in the field behind my house. They were the kind of feint that happens when you haven't fully focused. Thin, vertical smudges with two pale dots where a face should be, like the reflective strips on a jacket catching a distant car's headlights. At first I thought they were cows, because there's a herd that grazes on the state lot sometimes, and the moon makes eyes glow on animals. And then I realized the dots were too high, level with the shoulders on some of them, and there were too many to be cows, clustered that close to the house. I sat up. The sheets stuck to my legs. The air was warm for October, heavy with the smell of the cut hay from earlier in the week. The night was quiet in a charged way. The usual distant highway hiss had gone soft. I took a slow breath and Roxy's growl changed into a low whine that said she wanted me to do something. I slipped on jeans and a hoodie, grabbed my keys, and stepped out onto the porch. The boards sighed under my feet. When I reached the edge of the yard, I pulled the barn light switch. It popped and came to life, throwing a wash of yellow across the grass. The figures were still there, maybe 70 yards from the fence, standing in a loose line along the low rise that marks where the field drops off toward the creek. My first thought was people, teenagers with flashlights. My second was something more practical, reflective survey stakes, ghosted from the yard light. I trained the flashlight on them. The dots flashed back like eyes. They were human height, straight-backed. Some of them seemed to have something on their shoulders that picked up the light and sent it back in two precise specks. I walked the length of the porch and called out, "Hey!" My voice sounded embarrassingly loud in the night. No response. At one point, one of the figures tilted slightly, and the two specks went dim like someone had turned their head. Roxy sat on my heels, rigid. I took my phone out and tried to record. The screen focused on empty air. When I zoomed in on the spot where a figure stood, all I could see was a smear of gray and the meadow grass outlined in moonlight. Whatever reflected the porch light in a way that made them look like a face didn't show up as anything human unless I was watching with my eyes and not through glass and not on a screen. That was the first small mismatch of the night. The thing my eyes accepted didn't register to my phone. I walked down the short path to the yard gate. The field dropped away in a shallow bowl, wet in the ruts, and the morning star lights of the county line trembled far off. The figures didn't move toward me. They didn't move my direction at all. They stood like posts with pale pins of light where one'd expect eyes. I started toward the split rail fence. As I got closer, two of the figures, one's at the east end, blinked out, not in the way a flashlight dies, but like someone, very deliberately, turned their torso sideways. One instant, there were two pale dots in form. The next, the pale dots vanished, and there was only a dark vertical sliver where a person should have been. I stopped so suddenly, my boots sunk in the dew. The closest vanishings didn't look like hiding. They looked like a film removed from a frame. The space they occupied felt thinner for a second, like an exhale passing through cloth. I had the odd and small thought that maybe they'd crawled into the ditch or were lying flat in tall grass. But when I trained the torch into that patch of field, the grass there didn't stir. I shouted again. This time somebody, answered with a low sound that could have been a call or a wind through a hollow pipe. By the time I had my phone to my ear, the sound was gone. Roxy's nails clicked on the packed dirt behind me. The practical part of my brain insisted I call the sheriff. The other part wanted to stay out there and watch until my eyes burned and told me what they'd seen was real. I slid the phone into my pocket and kept walking along the fence line. The light from the house fell a little short, and when I stepped into that softer zone, every hair on my arms rose. The yard seemed to breathe a millimeter differently. I got to the point where I could see the nearest figure clear enough to tell whether it was a person or something else. It had broad shoulders, a straight stance. The reflective dots were on its chest, not its face, which made me think of tarps and backpacks. Someone must have been out there in high-vis for a reason. I called again, louder, and then the entire line of figures blinked out in the same exact way, one after another. Not in a wave, but like a string of bulbs someone had flicked. No one ran, no one dropped and rolled. It was the kind of movement you make when you're photogenic and you turn for a picture, a symmetrical change in orientation. And for the first time since I'd seen them through the window, the sound of the night moved back in. A cricket rasp, a far-off truck, tiny normal world things that had been absent earlier. I stood there breathing hard and felt ridiculous. It was close to what people do when they're trying to convince themselves rural life is the same as city life. I made my phone ring the sheriff's number, then hung it up before it connected because my thumb didn't have the nerve to press call. I walked back to the porch and locked the gate, then sat on the steps and watched the field until sweat cooled on my neck. A little while later, maybe 20 minutes, I noticed something else. The trail of dew on the grass leading out toward the trees had a patch flattened in a neat rectangle, maybe a yard across. It wasn't trampled like something had walked over. The grass lay parallel and pressed flat, like somebody had set an object down and then picked it up. It was damp and smelled faintly of metal and old hay. There were no footprints around the patch, no drag marks, nothing to suggest legs had entered or left that spot. I took a picture this time because it felt like the kind of tiny, explainable evidence that would make all of this less weird. When I checked the photo, the patch was there on the phone, but the colors were wrong, muted, as if the camera had picked up infrared more than light. The image file had a small line across it at the exact spot where the patch lay, and when I zoomed the line was a band of pixels that looked like a scratch. The scratch wasn't on my lens. I wiped it and took 3 more pictures. The patch was visible each time, but the next morning, when the sun had fully risen and the field had bleached to regular green, the grass lay normal, and the rectangle had filled itself back up. The smell had faded. I told myself no one would believe me. I told myself that might be why I hadn't called anyone in the first place. The sheriff would say kids or hunters or maybe you were dreaming, and the report would go into a drawer. But I'm the kind of person who notices the small off things and holds on to them until some explanation shows up. I couldn't find one that fit. By dawn, Roxy had curled up at my feet like she does when the world is safe again. She slept with one ear flicking because her dreams had dogs in them, and the light from the east was soft and innocent. I made coffee, tried to read the paper, and kept looking out the kitchen window at the line where the field met the tree line. The grass had no marks that morning except for the neat rectangle that had filled back in. The fence posts were where they'd always been. The county lot was a county lot, ordinary and empty. Later, when I took the garbage to the curb, a truck rolled down the county road and slowed by my mailbox. The driver leaned on the horn for one quick beep and gave a little wave. I waved back and felt the oddness like a bruise. There are some nights you will carry an image in you that other people do not have. It makes you careful in your speech, careful about how you say things that could sound like excuses for not sleeping. I don't have an answer for what I saw. I don't have a time-stamped video that proves anything. The phone photos are grainy in ways a camera's not supposed to be. The rectangle in the grass had an odd smell and left no tracks. and Roxy's growl was exactly what it should be when something is close enough to notice but not part of the world you know. I made it through the day. I did the chores, mowed the lawn, bent to pick up the kid's baseball that had rolled under the shed. The world resumed its honest smallness. I told the story to one neighbor over the fence while we replaced a broken post. He nodded and said, "All kinds of things out there at night, friend. Keep your dog close." That's what people say when they don't want to make any more of it than necessary. I promised myself I would lock the gate every night and keep a light on. I'll do the same again tonight. The field sits the same as it ever did, open, flat, indifferent. And somewhere in that plain, I know there will be room for things that look like people, and then, in a blink, aren't. I woke up in the middle of the night at Loch Lomond for no good reason. Normally when I camp, I sleep straight through until the birds kick off at dawn, but that night I came out of sleep like someone had shaken me. I lay there with my eyes open, waiting to figure out what had woken me, and it took a good 30 seconds before I realized what was wrong. It was quiet. Completely quiet. Usually when I camp out in Scotland, even in colder months, there's always some noise. The buzz of midges, the click of beetles in the grass, the odd bat making that faint scrape of wings if you're tuned into it. Sometimes you'll hear an owl, or at least the constant ripple of the loch if you're pitched close enough. That night, nothing, not even the usual rustle of leaves. The silence pressed in like I had earplugs in, but I knew I didn't. I lay there for maybe a full minute, barely breathing, and finally convinced myself I'd imagined it. I thought maybe I'd just woken during a lull. But then I noticed a faint color bleeding into the canvas of the tent. It wasn't moonlight. The moon had set hours before. I'd checked my phone earlier in the night before shutting it off, and it wasn't the orange or yellow of a torch beam. This was pale green, not a vivid laser pointer green, but soft like light through bottle glass. It spread across the tent wall in a shifting pattern like it was moving over the trees outside. At first, I thought a car must have pulled into the lay-by near the trailhead. Maybe someone parking up late and their headlights hitting the canopy at a weird angle. But the glow wasn't steady like headlights. It moved in smooth arcs, like it was scanning the treetops, sliding over the branches with an eerie kind of patience. I propped myself up on my elbows, heart hammering, and stared at the ceiling of the tent. The glow passed slowly across, like something outside was searching with a giant lamp. I didn't hear footsteps, no voices, no engine, just that dead silence and the shifting green light. I reached for the zip of the flap, then stopped, holding my breath. I don't know why. I felt this deep, primal urge not to make noise, not to move too quickly. My fingers rested on the zip pull and I froze. The glow lingered on the treetops just beyond my tent, and then it drifted away, sliding across the forest as if it had lost interest. I counted in my head to 30 before I dared move. When I finally unzipped the flap and leaned out, the glow was gone. Just darkness. The tree line across the loch was a faint silhouette, and the water barely moved. It was so still it looked frozen. The silence continued for a long time, long enough that I started to get scared in a different way, because even if the glow had been someone with a torch or a strange reflection, that didn't explain why every insect in the woods had stopped. The longer it stayed quiet, the more it felt unnatural. I remember deliberately coughing just to hear a noise, and the sound of my own throat was shockingly loud. Eventually, faintly, I started to hear water lapping against the bank again. Then, after what felt like ages, a single insect started up, a faint whine like a mosquito, then another. Within a couple of minutes, the night sounded normal again, as though someone had pressed resume on the world. I sat up in the tent for hours, just listening. Every time a branch creaked or an owl hooted in the distance, I jumped. I kept watching the treetops through the mesh of the flap, waiting for that pale green glow to come back. It never did. In the morning, everything looked ordinary. Birds were loud. The air had that damp smell of moss and pine. I walked down to the water's edge with my kettle to fill it, and I stared at the tree line across the loch where the glow had drifted. Nothing unusual, just trees and mist. But that silence and the way the glow had moved like it was searching, I've never had another night like that camping. I didn't cut my trip short, but I couldn't shake the feeling I'd been watched, or worse, examined. When I packed up to leave 2 days later, I glanced back at the clearing before heading down the trail, and for just a moment, I swear the forest looked too still again, like it was holding its breath. I was out before dawn because that's how you do it when the weather says it might be worth a day. The forecast had been vague, gray with a chance of clearing, but the sea looked flat from the shore, a sheet of dull pewter that promised the small shoals would be visible once the light came. I'd been fishing these waters my whole life, and the bit of coast north of St. Andrews was one of those places you thought you knew. That morning, it felt like I was the only person who'd been left awake. I puttered the little Boston whaler past the rocks at the edge of the bay, keeping low to avoid the bird scatters near the kelp beds. The tide was out enough that my usual markers, the big, jagged boulder, the rusted post, were all half exposed, the waterline kissing their undersides. It was the sort of morning where small things stood out, the pattern of wind on water, a shoal of sprats rising, the way the gulls squawked and settled in different numbers. When I say small things, I mean the things that tell you whether a day will be good or not. Around 7, when the light was a flat gray, I noticed the birds. Not just fewer, but wrong. There were pockets where the surface should have been full of motion, and there was nothing. No dabble of white, no flare. The gulls were on the cliffs, not on the water. A tern passed low and then banked away as if something had startled it. I didn't feel like moving closer yet. I sat with the engine idling and had another look through the binoculars. The first odd thing I saw was on the horizon, just off the line where sea met sky. From that distance, it could have been anything, a fishing boat tied up at anchor, a marker buoy, but the shape was too smooth and too bright. It was silver in tone, like the inside of a foil packet. It hovered, not bobbing with the swell, but steady, as if someone had nailed it to the sky. The light didn't hit it like a reflection. It seemed to glow from its own surface. I eased closer, not because I was brave, but because that's what you do. Closer gives answers. The closer I got, the more other little things added up wrong. The air felt cleaner, like someone had turned a window in the engine room. My radio kept filling with static even though there wasn't a storm in sight. The static wasn't loud. It was a thin hiss that rose and fell with the boat's speed, like something tuned to frequency that shouldn't be there. When I turned the radio off, the hiss stopped. Then a second later, a faint, low sound threaded under everything, more felt than heard, like a distant harbor or engine idling and not quite in time. I had the binoculars up when I realized the object's reflection was missing. That's the word for it. Missing. The water around it showed the usual ripple and glimmer, but where you'd expect the silver shape's twin on the surface, there was nothing. I watched the waves slap at that place, and the surface broke as if it knew there was nothing to reflect. It made no sense. Even buoyant stuff makes a shadow and a double in the sea. The ripples would catch it, but the water acted like the light never reached it. I slowed until the motor was just a soft purr. I could see the object now as a loose, silent oval, maybe the size of a small trawler, but without any hull or mast, just a shape suspended a few meters above the waves. No wake, no heat shimmer, no birds circling it. It was motionless like a buoy, but suspended above the surface in flat air that smelled of salt and nothing else. The binoculars made it fringe and close. I could see lines on its skin, but no bolts or seams, a continuous sheen, dull, like tarnished chrome. I thought about turning back then. I don't like things without names, and this was a thing without a name. I thought of home, the kettle on the stove, Maggie asleep with the radio. Then I thought, sod it. I'm a curious man. I brought the boat in nearer until the bow pointed toward it, and I left the engine in neutral so I'd drift. That's when the tide did something I'd never seen. The water that had been sitting low around the rocks started to move inward in a way that didn't match the swell. It wasn't a wave so much as a broad shoulder of water that came in fast, faster than the charts said it should. The kelp beds that had been waving lazily were suddenly knitting together, then stretching as if someone had gathered the sea by the hem and dragged it. The rocks I'd measured for years went under so quick the whole boat shuddered and brushed against a patch I'd always kept clear. It was fast enough to make me curse and throw the engine into gear to keep a little movement, but I didn't want to rope the boat around anything. My hands were slick, my heart was up around my throat. The surge wasn't the usual trick of the channel or a gust. It felt deliberate. And while the sea moved inward, the silver thing stayed where it had been, calm, detached, like a ceiling lamp over a kitchen sink. I'd been in storms that made fine men pray, and I know how water remembers the moon, but this had none of that rule set. The tide rose along the whole little bay, neat as if someone had flipped a basin. The gulls took to the wind in a long, trying flight, their calls sharp and staccato. The radio crackled back to life when I'd flicked it on for a second. No voice, just the thin hiss again, and the low sound under the engine hummed in my teeth. I put the binoculars up once more. The silver thing was the same, but the lack of reflection sat in my head like a missing brick. I scanned the surface around it, expecting to see some distortion, a slick of oil, but nothing. The water looked right apart from the lack of twin. When I lowered the binoculars, I felt the air shift like a draught in a closed room. The sound under the engine vanished at that same moment, and the whir of my motor seemed brash and intrusive. Then, in the next breath, the silver shape dimmed, not like switching off, but shading down, as if someone had folded a curtain over it. The field of light around it softened into the normal gray of the sea and sky. You know when the sun goes behind thin cloud and everything turns polite? It was like that. And the second it softened, the tide stilled, as if someone had set a hand on the water's back and told it to stay. The quiet that descended wasn't the calm of a day ending, it was hollow. The low hum never came back. The only noise was the slap of little waves against the hull. And even that sounded wrong, too crisp. I didn't see it vanish. One blink and the object wasn't there anymore. There was no skid of motion, no upward streak. One blink, and my binocular field showed only the regular dull horizon and a band of white where waves broke further out. I found myself laughing once, a short, sharp laugh that came out of me without control. It felt like the sort of laugh you make when you've let fear uncork and don't know what to do with it. I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe a reflection from something farther off, a hallucination from a long night and little sleep. Maybe the radio static and the tide were unrelated. Maybe. I didn't stay to prove any of those maybes. I tightened the engine and kept a hand on the wheel until the little bay was behind me. The houses along the seafront were empty and dark when I came in, the net drying racks stacked like ribs. Maggie was on the table with a pot of tea boiling over and a bowl for my boots. She looked up and said my name like she'd expected me to come in messy. She always did, the way wives know the shape of their men. I tried to speak normal, but my words kept catching. At home, I scrubbed salt off my face and the back of my neck, put the kettle on, and tried to make sense of the morning in my head between sips. I told her about the birds, about the sound, about the shape. She listened and asked the sensible questions. Did I see any markings, any heat, any craft? I answered as best I could. She asked if I'd gone too close. I said I'd kept a distance. I said I'd never seen a tide move like that in my life. By noon, the light had changed. The sea looked like a different thing. Blue and willing, people out on the promenade with dogs. Someone was walking the line where the water had rushed in, picking up shells and laughing because the morning had been chilly but clear. The bay looked ordinary in that way that worries me most. The world goes on, steady, with or without an answer. I told the harbor master when he came by that afternoon because that's what you do. You tell a man who keeps a book. He nodded and scratched at his beard, asked me to note the time. He said he'd heard nothing on the VHF. He said he'd had calls about a strange fog bank 2 miles out the week before, which had been gone by noon. He said a lot of things like men who are used to things that aren't right do, understandable, plausible, and then nothing that closed the circle. That night I slept badly and woke at odd hours, listening for a hum I never heard again. For a week, I found myself looking at the bay from the window when it should have been my mind on other things. I kept the binoculars on their hook by the door for longer than I should have. Sometimes the gulls would hang in a way that made my skin prickle, but the sea stayed steady. I don't have a tidy end to this tale. The silver thing didn't come back. The tide never surged that way again. I still can't explain why the surface where it hung didn't reflect it, why the water moved like hands had grabbed it, why the radio hissed at the moment I drew near and stopped the moment it dimmed. I can tell you only what I saw and how the morning pressed at me after. The rest sits there, a blank, easy to look past when the kettle's on and Maggie's humming in the kitchen, but as neat and stubborn as a bruise when the light hits just right and the sea looks like pewter again. It was just after midnight when I noticed it. I'd been sitting in the living room of my flat in Leith, scrolling on my phone with the TV muted. The curtains were half open, and from my window I get a clear view south toward Arthur's Seat if the sky isn't too heavy with clouds. That night, it was cold and still, the kind of autumn night where the air outside looks sharp. I leaned back on the sofa to stretch and happened to glance out the window. At first, I thought I was looking at a plane. There was a single white light hovering above the outline of Arthur's Seat. It wasn't blinking like normal aircraft lights do, though, just a steady glow, a bit larger than I'd expect for a plane that high. It held my eye because it wasn't moving. I sat forward, elbows on my knees, and kept watching. The light hung there for maybe 10-15 seconds, perfectly still. Then it blinked. Once. Twice. 3 times. Clean, sharp flashes like a camera going off but brighter and each separated by a second or two. The instant after the third blink, it slid sideways across the sky. Not upward or downward, not fading like a plane turning, just a clean, horizontal streak to the left, faster than anything I've ever seen move across the horizon. It stopped dead for a split second, then shot again in another direction and was gone. I got up and pressed against the glass. The whole skyline above the hill was empty. No light. Nothing. The sky had that thin veil of clouds lit faintly orange by the city, but there was nothing where I'd seen it. I stood there for a while, convincing myself I'd maybe seen a drone. Edinburgh's full of tourists and people fly drones around Holyrood Park all the time, though not legally that late at night. But no drone I've seen moved like that. The sudden stop alone didn't make sense. I told myself to let it go and sat back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept the curtains open and found myself looking back every couple of minutes. Around half an hour later, I noticed something strange again. Not the light, but the street below. The stretch outside my building is usually quiet at that hour. Maybe the odd taxi or someone walking home. But that night, it was dead. No cars, no footsteps, nothing. I live on a corner, so I usually see traffic lights change, even if nobody's there, the green glow against the stonework. It was like the whole street had paused. I switched the TV off and just listened. Normally, you hear distant hum, engines, people laughing a few streets away, the faint clatter of bins if it's collection night. That night it was silent, so silent that I could hear my fridge humming from the kitchen. Then a low vibration passed through the window pane. Not strong, not like a lorry going past, more subtle. The glass gave a faint buzz under my hand. I pressed my palm against it and felt it tremble once, then again, like something distant was pulsing. I turned back toward Arthur's Seat. The sky was still empty, but the glow of the city seemed oddly dim. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was overtired. When I looked again, I could just barely make out a faint shape above the hill. It wasn't lit, not like the earlier light, but darker than the sky itself, like a shadow cut out of the clouds. It was big, too, larger than a plane, though it didn't have any edges I could clearly see. It looked almost smudged, like a thumbprint on glass. I leaned so close to the window my breath fogged it up. The vibration came again, and this time my floorboards creaked even though I hadn't moved. I flicked off the lamp in the corner so the room was dark and crouched near the window. I didn't want whatever it was to see me, though I couldn't explain why that thought even crossed my mind. The shape hovered there for maybe a minute. No lights, no sound except that faint vibration you felt more than heard. Then in an instant it shifted, straight upward this time, vanishing into the low cloud. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. The vibration stopped immediately. I stayed frozen, waiting. My eyes scanned the sky until they hurt, but nothing else appeared. After a while, the normal sounds of the city started up again. A car passed. Somewhere a siren wailed faintly. I hadn't even realized how tense I was until my shoulders started aching. I pulled the curtains shut and sat on the floor back against the sofa. I didn't look outside again the rest of the night. Even in the morning when I opened the curtains, I half expected to see something hanging there. But the hill was just a hill again, and the city was its usual noisy self. I didn't tell anyone at work about it. I couldn't think how to explain it without sounding ridiculous. All I know is I saw that light blink move faster than anything I've ever witnessed, and then something much bigger was sitting there in the sky over Edinburgh. So quiet and still, it made the whole city feel wrong. I'd been training for months to do Ben Nevis in winter conditions. It wasn't anything extreme, just a personal challenge. I'd done some smaller Munros in snow, but never the big one. That March weekend, the forecast looked clear but cold, steady minus 6 degrees Celsius near the summit, light wind. I figured it was my best shot before the season turned. I set off early from the Glen Nevis Visitor Center, still dark, headlamp on. The car park had only 3 other vehicles. I saw one guy packing his gear into a big red rucksack but didn't talk to him. The lower path was iced over but manageable with spikes. My plan was straightforward. Up the mountain track, summit by midday, back down before it clouded over. By the time the sky started turning gray-blue, I was maybe halfway up. Snow crusted on the rocks, crisp underfoot, no one else in sight. I stopped near a small cairn to drink water and adjust my gloves. The air felt heavy and still, but that wasn't unusual at that altitude. Another hour and I could see the upper plateau. Visibility was good, just a few thin clouds drifting low in the glen below. It was quiet, no bird calls, no wind gusting against my hood, just the crunch of my crampons. Then I heard something faint. Not a noise exactly, more like a drop in pressure. That sensation before a storm, but sharper. I paused. My watch showed 11:47. The sunlight was muted, and like the brightness had been dialed back slightly. I told myself it was just my eyes adjusting after looking at the snow. I kept climbing. At the summit, there were only 2 other people, an older man with a beard and a younger woman, maybe his daughter. They were taking photos near the trig point. We nodded but didn't speak. I walked to the edge to look out over the glen. The view was crisp, every ridge and shadow sharp. That's when it happened. The light dimmed just slightly, and the temperature dropped hard enough that I saw my breath fog thick and fast. I zipped up my jacket. No wind, no sound, nothing moving, but a dark shape slid across the snow. It wasn't a cloud shadow. It was perfectly triangular, like a cutout. I froze. It passed over the summit in total silence. No fluttering snow, no gust of air. Just there one moment and moving the next. Slow enough to track with my eyes, but faster than a cloud. It felt like it was both above me and around me at the same time. The man and the woman stopped talking. I glanced at them. Both were staring at the ground. The shadow stretched maybe 30 meters across, sharp edge, darker than any normal shadow. My brain kept trying to fit it into something logical. Maybe a helicopter, maybe some kind of sailplane. But there was no sound, no movement of air, no object visible above us. Then it passed beyond the edge of the summit and vanished over the north face. The brightness returned like a switch had been flipped. The air was still bitterly cold, but the extra drop eased. I realized I was gripping my trekking pole so tightly my knuckles hurt. The man muttered something in Gaelic and started packing up quickly. The woman followed without looking at me. They headed down the path, boots crunching fast on the ice. I stood there alone, heart hammering, trying to see if there was anything in the sky. Nothing. Clear blue-gray, no planes, no birds. I took a photo of the snow where the shadow had crossed, but of course it was just snow in the picture. When I finally started down myself, the path felt different. The snow squeaked underfoot in a higher pitch, like walking on styrofoam. My compass needle trembled faintly when I checked it at a junction. It wasn't spinning wildly, just quivering back and forth a few degrees. I blamed the metal of the trig point, but it kept doing it for another 15 minutes as I descended. Halfway down, I caught sight of the 2 ahead of me, far lower on the track, moving quickly. I thought about shouting, but didn't. Something about the silence felt like it would swallow my voice. The rest of the descent was normal. Snow softening a little under the sun, a light breeze picking up again. By the time I reached the car park, my watch said 15:06. The man and woman's car was gone. Mine was one of only two left. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before turning the key, my gloves still on. I kept looking up at the summit through the windshield. Everything looked exactly as it should. Just a big mountain, snow on top, sky above. I've gone back since in different seasons. Nothing like that's happened again. But every time I reach the plateau, I find myself glancing down at the snow, waiting to see that impossible triangle slide across it, silent and sharp like it was never really there. I set up camp on the west shore of Loch Marie late that afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. I'd taken the old road from Aknasheen, the one that narrows to barely a single lane and snakes between thick pine forests and peat bogs. I liked the drive for its quiet, no tourists this far out, just the smell of wet heather and the occasional sheep on the shoulder. I was there mostly for the sunset. My camera bag was stuffed with lenses and tripods. I've always liked landscape photography, the kind that makes the loch look endless and the mountains taller than they really are. I set up on a little clearing just above the waterline where the grass slopes gently into the loch. The light was golden, spilling across the water, catching the pine needles in a soft glow. I took the first few shots, adjusting my tripod, moving the camera back and forth. Nothing unusual yet. A few midges swarmed around my head, but I didn't mind. The wind was calm, almost unnaturally still, which made the water mirror flat, perfect for reflections. I crouched to check my first pictures on the screen. That's when I thought I saw a flash, a quick glint at the far end of the loch, but I blinked, and it was gone. I shrugged. Maybe the sun had caught a ripple in the water, a reflection from some rock. I took another shot. Another flash, just for a fraction of a second at the same spot, though the light didn't make sense. My eyes strained, but the horizon was empty. No birds, no planes, no clouds. Just the mountains, the loch, the trees. By the time I had set up for a wider shot, the air had gotten colder. The kind of chill that sneaks into your hands and nose even when you're wearing gloves and a wool hat. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Not just the loch or the wind, but even the usual distant hum of traffic from the main road seemed gone. I raised the camera again, framing the loch, the sky streaked with pink and orange. I snapped a series of photos, each one a few seconds apart, trying to catch the last of the light. That's when I noticed it, or at least what would show up later. In every single frame, at the far edge of the loch, there was a small, triangular shape. It was faint, metallic looking, moving impossibly fast across the water. I didn't see it with my eyes, only on the screen. At first I thought I'd misclicked, some lens flare or motion blur artifact. I moved the camera, snapped again, same thing. The shape had shifted in position, always triangular, always moving, always beyond my ability to see it without the camera. I lowered the camera, scanning the loch with my own eyes. Nothing, no sound, no ripple, no trace of movement. My pulse picked up. I pointed the camera again, clicked, and checked the screen. There it was again, closer this time, as if it had been tracking me. I walked a little closer to the water, my boots sinking into the wet grass. The air smelled of damp pine and earth, exactly as it had before. Nothing seemed different, except for the nagging feeling that I was being watched. I glanced behind me. The trees were still, the shadows deep, but the loch, flat and silver in the dying light, was perfect. Yet I could feel it. Something had moved out there, something that shouldn't be able to hover above the water, move so fast and leave no trace. I took a few more photos, backing up slowly. That's when I noticed the faintest vibration in the ground, like a soft thrum. Not the wind, not water, just this steady pulse beneath my feet. I paused, breathing shallow, trying to convince myself it was just my heartbeat amplified by the quiet. But the vibration didn't stop, even as I took another step back. Then, over the loch, a shimmer, just a flicker, like heat waves on asphalt. The triangular shape appeared again, now faintly glowing, moving in a straight line that made no sense with the wind or the water. I swiveled my tripod, following it, but it moved faster than my eyes could track. By the time I looked up, it was gone. Nothing left. The loch was calm, the mountains shadowed, only my pulse and that faint thrum remained. I packed up quickly as the last light left the sky. The vibration underfoot stopped once I moved away from the clearing, as if it had been tied to that specific spot. I kept checking the tree line behind me, half expecting to see something, anyone, but there was only the night settling over the hills. Back at the campsite, I pulled out my camera and scrolled through the images on the LCD. Every shot from that last half hour had the shape, sometimes high above the water, sometimes barely skimming the surface. Always triangular, always moving impossibly fast. My hands shook as I zoomed in. There was no blur, no distortion, nothing to suggest it was a trick of the lens, and yet I had seen nothing with my own eyes. I checked the surrounding area, shone my flashlight over the water. Nothing. The loch was just itself. Dark, still, silent. No waves, no ripples, nothing disturbed. I even walked the shoreline, barefoot through the cold sand and pebbles. No footprints except mine, no marks in the grass, no sign that anything had been there at all. I kept the camera on my lap as I sat by the fire, watching the last smoke curl into the night. The images glimmered faintly on the screen. I tried to rationalize it. Lens artifact? Light reflection? Maybe a seagull catching the last sun? But the triangular shapes weren't random, and they didn't match anything in the environment. The loch had been empty, silent, yet my camera insisted otherwise. By the time I fell asleep in my tent, the air had grown cold enough to fog the inside of the canvas. I dreamed of the loch glowing, of triangles moving beneath the surface, silent and impossibly fast, rising and falling with no regard for physics. When I woke, the loch was calm, the sun barely cresting the mountains. I hiked back to the car, leaving no trace of my night except the photos on the SD card. The rest of the loch seemed normal, as if the shapes had been a mirage. But I've gone back twice since, camera in hand, every time hoping to catch another flicker. Nothing, not a single image, not a pulse, not a shimmer. I still don't understand it. The images exist. The loch looked empty to my eyes. And that pulse underfoot, I can't explain that either. I tell people about it, but they smile politely and nod, chalk it up to imagination or photography tricks. Maybe it was. But I know what my camera saw. And every so often, when the wind is still and the sun hits the water just right, I swear I feel the faint hum of something moving just out of sight, far across the loch, impossible to catch. I was walking home late one night through the cornfields near my house in central Iowa. It was around 11 p.m., maybe a little later. I usually don't take that route after dark, but that night I missed the bus and figured I could cut through the fields to save some time. The air was still and humid, the kind you get in late summer just before a storm rolls in, though no rain was coming yet. The moon was mostly hidden by clouds, so the field was darker than usual. The corn was tall, maybe 8 feet or more, and it rustled softly in the breeze. I could hear crickets and the occasional frog croak, but mostly just the quiet shuffle of my footsteps through the dirt path I knew ran between the rows. I wasn't worried. I'd been out there plenty of times before, usually in the daytime, but sometimes in the evening with friends. Never by myself this late, though. As I was walking, I caught a faint red glow ahead, just between the stalks. At first, I thought it was some farm equipment left running, or maybe one of those small blinking marker lights they sometimes put on irrigation systems. The lights were small and blinked slowly, red and soft, like the tail lights on a tractor. It was about 20 feet ahead, not too far. Curious, I headed toward it. As I got closer, the lights seemed to lower from where I thought they were. I looked more carefully and realized they weren't on any machines or poles. Instead, the red lights hovered just above the ground, flickering gently like little fireflies, but in a very steady pattern. They didn't flash wildly or move around erratically, just a slow, rhythmic blink. I stopped and looked around, trying to figure out what was going on. The corn around the lights didn't move, except when I brushed against it. The lights then slowly began to rise. Not fast, more like a smooth, careful float. They lifted from just above the dirt up to about eye level with me, maybe 4 or 5 feet off the ground. I swear they didn't drift away or scatter like bugs might, just moved straight up, one after the other, as if someone was raising them by hand. I was getting a little uneasy now, but I wasn't sure what I was even seeing. I called out softly, "Hello?" But there was no answer. The lights blinked in the same slow pattern, Nothing changed except they were all at roughly the same height now, facing me from the rows on either side. My heart was starting to beat faster, and I pulled out my phone, flipping on the flashlight to get a better look. The moment the light came on, the red lights vanished. Just gone, like they were never there. The cornfield was pitch dark again, except for my phone's beam cutting through the stalks. I stayed still for a moment, scanning with the flashlight. Nothing. No sounds except my breathing and the usual bugs. I turned the light off and took a step forward, then another. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy, like the air was holding its breath. I was about halfway through the path when I heard a soft tapping behind me. Not loud, more like a faint knocking sound on the stalks, rhythmic, almost like a code but slower. I spun around, shining the flashlight back, but nothing was there. No movement, no shadow, just empty corn swaying lightly. I tried to convince myself it was a branch, or maybe an animal, a raccoon or a bird maybe. But the tapping stopped as suddenly as it started, and I didn't hear anything else. I didn't want to stick around, so I quickened my pace, walking faster through the field. The path wasn't straight. It twisted a little with the way the crops were planted, so I had to be careful not to trip. The night felt colder now, even though the air hadn't changed much. Then I noticed something else. The flashlight on my phone started flickering, just for a second, then back on. I tapped the screen, tried to reset it, but it was glitchy, dimming and brightening like it was struggling to stay on. I stopped again, looked around. That's when I heard it, a low humming noise. Not loud, maybe just a few feet away, but definitely there. It wasn't mechanical like a tractor or electric like a power line, more like a deep, constant vibration that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I pointed my phone toward the sound, but the beam was too weak now to see anything. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably some animal or wind through the stalks, but I was wrong. Suddenly, the humming stopped, and the air grew dead quiet again, like someone had flipped a switch. I felt my skin prickling, like I just walked through something cold and invisible. I didn't like it. I didn't want to be there. I started moving again, faster now, the corn rustling loudly as I pushed through. My phone finally died completely, leaving me with only the moonlight, which was still faint and filtered through thick clouds. Then, out of the dark, I saw something else. A pair of red lights blinking slowly, low to the ground again, just like before. They were exactly where I'd seen the first set when I started. I froze. The lights didn't move or respond. They just blinked, steady and calm, as if waiting for me. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my eyes on them, but not wanting to get too close. My throat felt dry. I didn't want to look away, but I also didn't want to stare. After a few seconds, I turned and ran out of the field, back toward the main road and the streetlights near my house. When I got home, everything was normal. My phone wouldn't turn on until I plugged it in, and even then, it acted sluggish. My skin felt like it had been sunburned, tight and warm, but I hadn't been outside in the sun that day. I told my parents I got lost in the dark and just got scared. They didn't ask many questions. It's been weeks since that night, but sometimes when I'm outside alone at dusk or in the dark, I think about those lights. I wonder if I should have tried to follow them, or if I was lucky to get away at all. I don't really know what they were, or if anyone else saw them. I don't walk through the cornfields at night anymore. I was in the kitchen just past midnight, leaning against the counter with a mug of instant coffee, when it happened. The house was quiet except for the old refrigerator humming in the corner, the kind of hum that makes you think you're imagining other sounds. Then I heard it, static. Full, crackling, rushing static like a storm on AM, but it was coming from the radio on the shelf. Only the radio wasn't plugged in. The cord trailed limply over the edge, and I'd been staring at it for 10 minutes before it happened. I froze, coffee halfway to my mouth, staring at the black plastic box that should have been dead. I muttered, "No way," out loud, and the static swelled a little louder, then softened like it was breathing. My first thought was a hallucination, too much caffeine, stress from work, but the sound was persistent, full-bodied, and real enough to make my teeth hurt a little. I set the mug down, trying to rationalize, and the sound stopped abruptly. Dead silence. Nothing except the refrigerator. I went to the window above the sink out of habit, looking at the dark field beyond the yard. It's just a flat pasture, a line of trees at the far end, nothing remarkable, nothing with lights except the occasional distant farmhouse. That's when I saw it, a soft, pulsing glow, low to the ground, moving slowly across the field. It was pale white, almost gray, like a diluted flashlight, and it seemed to breathe, fading and brightening in a rhythm that matched nothing natural I'd seen before. When I blinked, it had shifted slightly farther along, smooth, deliberate, unhurried, without the wobble of any drone or animal lantern. I knew. I opened the window for a better look, the cold night air brushing my face. The sound came back, low at first, like the static was echoing across the field itself. I swore the pulses of light and the rise and fall of the sound were synchronized. Light brightens, static peaks, then both fade. I leaned closer, gripping the windowsill, trying to see what it was. There was no discernible shape, just that glow drifting across the grass, silent except for the eerie accompaniment of static. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture, mostly to prove I wasn't losing it. The screen came back black. I tried the camera again, moved to the doorway, and the static seemed to follow me, like the house itself was humming with it, even though the radio still sat unplugged. My ears felt strained. The sound wasn't piercing, but it carried weight, a density that made me tense. Then it stopped. Everything stopped. The glow blinked out, the static vanished, and even the refrigerator seemed quieter. I rubbed my eyes and stepped back. Maybe I'd imagined it, the old brain playing tricks after a long day, but the field looked different somehow. Lighter at the edges, almost damp with something I couldn't place. I tried to shake the feeling. I poured the rest of the coffee, muttering that it was nothing. I sat at the counter and waited. The static returned, fainter this time, almost hesitant, and then vanished again without the light accompanying it. I noticed the clock. 15 minutes had passed in a blur. When I looked at the window again, the glow returned. Same pulsing rhythm, drifting across the field in slow, smooth arcs. My heart picked up, but I kept reminding myself it had to be something explainable. A flashlight, a car, a neighbor's work light. But the field was empty. I opened the back door quietly, stepping out onto the porch to get a better look. The air smelled sharp, dry, like the night had been scrubbed clean of everything else. I crept to the edge of the yard. The glow moved silently, never touching the trees, never flickering from wind or leaves. My phone rang out of nowhere. A text I didn't recognize, no number, just a string of nonsense characters. I stared at it and dropped the phone, feeling my pulse spike. By the time I bent to pick it up, the light had vanished and the static died again, leaving nothing but the normal hum of the world. I went back inside, doors locked, lights dim. I tried to explain it to myself, maybe some kind of electrical interference, maybe a prank, maybe a strange reflection. Nothing accounted for the timing, the rhythm, or the way it seemed aware of me being out there. I couldn't shake the sensation that it had paused, watching, waiting, testing how I'd react. I sat down with a notebook and started jotting details, times, duration, intensity, everything I could remember. Every time I looked up, the field seemed normal, mundane, yet I knew it wasn't. There was an afterimage, a residue of motion, like the night remembered something I didn't. Sleep came eventually, fitful and shallow. I woke around 4 a.m., checked the window, the field empty, the world silent except for the refrigerator. I walked through the house, every door, every light switch, double-checking. Everything normal, unremarkable, mundane. By morning, I could almost convince myself it was a dream. Almost. But the radio? The unplugged radio sat on the shelf, still and black, no power, no cord anywhere attached. And for days after, whenever I passed it, the memory of that pulsing light and the accompanying static made me pause. I went back to the porch at night, looked at the field, but nothing appeared. No glow, no static, nothing but the wind in the grass and the distant low hum of traffic far away. I thought about telling someone, anyone, but what could I say? A pulsing light, static from an unplugged radio, a field that felt alive. The words sounded crazy even in my head, so I kept it to myself. Sometimes late, I'll catch a shimmer at the edge of my vision, a blink too quick for a star. I'll check the radio out of habit. Plugged in or not, the static is gone now, but I can swear the silence feels different. Waiting. Patient. And some nights, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear it. Soft, low, just at the edge of hearing. like a signal I can't quite tune. I finished charting the last med and pushed my chair back from the workstation because my legs were gone. It was the kind of night where everything felt slow, the third consecutive night shift, and a sky that had been leaking drizzle on and off for hours. My name's Elena. I've been a nurse on nights at St. Mary's for 6 years. The parking lot light by the front entrance hummed like an old refrigerator, and the night clerk was already in his cot in the security office, headphones on, so I grabbed my bag and headed out. Small things were off before I even left the unit. The telemetry monitors had been quiet for hours, usually at least 2 people beeping somewhere, but the boards were oddly blank, like everyone had been discharged at once. The oxygen wall gauges in room 12 cycled in a softer rhythm than usual, and when I checked the clock on the med cart, it had for a good 10 seconds before catching up. I made a joke to Luis at the desk. Ghost shift, huh? And he gave me that tired half smile and said, weird night. He didn't laugh. That's how nights start to pile up. A few things you can shrug off and a couple that don't fit together. On the way out, I passed the chapel door. The light above it was on, even though it's usually off at night. It threw a rectangle of warm yellow over the wet pavement. Someone had left a pair of shoes outside, neat by the step, like a person had walked out barefoot and never come back. I thought about asking security, but the guard's window was dark and empty. The automatic doors sighed and closed behind me, and I walked past the ambulance bay where the crew was finishing a cigarette. Long night? I asked. They shrugged. One of them squinted at the sky and said, storm's weird, then walked away like he didn't want to talk about it. I always park at the far end of staff lot because it's quieter. My car is an old Subaru with a coat of salt and a dent in the rear bumper that I keep promising to fix. As I crossed the row of cars, the lights from the building threw long bars across the asphalt. There was a stray patient information leaflet caught under a windshield wiper, flapping slowly. I stopped to pick it up and fold it, habit more than kindness, when every car alarm in the lot all at once erupted. It was the strangest cacophony I've ever heard. Metallic, thin, like someone had turned on a dozen tiny sirens. They didn't sound angry, not like alarms when someone's trying to break in. They sounded almost coordinated, a single note bouncing between vehicles like a ripple. I had the leaflet in my hands, and I remember my lungs emptying because the noise came on so sudden. People in scrubs looked up from half-sheltered benches. An orderly stepped out from behind the triage doors, and a security camera on the roof of the ER feed wobbled in its mount like a head turning. I froze under the fluorescent spill and watched the lot through the glass of the hospital's east wing. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the windows, as clear as if it were a literal thing in the air, a silver oval was drifting over the building. It was low enough that its underside, whatever underside meant for it, blocked a block of the sodium halo from the parking lot lights. The shape wasn't sharp-edged, more like a slab of metal wrapped in satin. It moved slow, deliberately, and the reflection made it look like it was walking across the sky right above the roofline. Even then, my brain kept offering safe explanations. Balloon, a blimp, a police drone, but the oval didn't have any lights, not the steady red or blinking greens you expect. No strobes, no beam. It made no sound, no thrum or distant wind. The lot alarms kept squealing in that same single pitch, and the world felt like a film running just a hair too fast or too slow. I watched the thing in the glass, and half of me was thinking to pull out my phone. The other half kept me rooted to the spot. My hands felt damp, and I realized I hadn't noticed until then that the coat I had on was soaked through at the shoulders, the drizzle more of a mist now. By the time I found the courage to look up, not at the reflection, at the real sky above the building, there was nothing. Empty clouds, the usual halo of sodium and moonlight. I blinked, and something like a pause in my chest eased. The car alarms cut off at the same breathless instant the oval vanished from the glass. No one clapped, no one cheered. People just stared at the paper in their hands or at the asphalt where spray was beating in little silver menace. A security guard came out then, flashlight tracing and collar up against the mist. His radio clicked and hissed but carried no one else's voice. He looked at me, eyebrows up, and I told him what I had seen, the reflection. He squinted up, then at the patrol car, then back at the night sky, and said, "You and me both," as if that meant anything at all. He told me the alarms had all gone off in an exact sequence and then shut off again, and that watch cams picked up the noise, but nothing in the frames but white smear for a second. He hesitated and then added, and the timestamp jumped on the feed, 9 minutes covered in static. He wasn't the kind of guy to make stories. He was the guy who counted cigarettes and kept a tidy desk. I heard the tightness in his voice, and I realized I was carrying the same thing. I pressed my forehead briefly to my steering wheel before getting in. My hands shook enough that they slid across the rim when I started the engine. The heater coughed, then warmed, and outside the windshield, the world went back to ordinary. Wet asphalt, a couple of patients huddled under a bus shelter, a couple of headlights moving away down the access road. I told myself, out loud, that I was tired and on edge. That made sense. That's the kind of sentence you give yourself when you want to believe the regular world is still the regular world. The drive home is normally a half hour of static and nothing, radio turned low, coffee cup cooling in the cup holder. That night, the radio cut out again around the county line for a full 10 miles, just dead air, and then came back like a train pulling into a station. The street signs looked wrong for a few minutes. Anytime I blinked, they seemed to be one word off, or the fonts thicker. My calendar notification dinged and told me it was 3:17 a.m. when my phone had said 3:08 at the hospital. I thought about the security feed timestamp and the guard's static report, and I told myself I was making patterns out of noise. When I pulled into my driveway, the house lights gave me a small domestic comfort. My cat, Miso, met me at the door with an accusation of cold paws and a tail curved like a question mark. I left my wet coat in a heap on the foyer chair and made coffee because it's what I always do, and because the motions of making it, measuring grounds, the metallic scrape, the whir of the kettle, feel like assembling the pieces of a life back into place. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with a mug and the window open a crack and kept watching the sky. I told myself I would go back in the morning and ask someone if they'd seen anything. I thought about calling my sister, but the story sounds thin when you say it out loud. A reflection and alarms and a thing that wasn't there when you turned. People give you a half-sympathetic laugh. You need rest, and that's a polite end to a strange night. At some point between news reports and the kettle's second refilling, I checked my watch again. It was 3 minutes ahead of the phone. I set them both down and left them there, not sure which one to trust. The world had a seam in it somewhere, like a pattern that got knit twice over in a place and made a ridge under your fingers. The coffee grew cold. Miso slept in the curled fist of my palm. Dawn came wrong and kind of soft, pink in the east through the clouds. I drove back to work at 7 because I always do, and the lot looked ordinary in daytime. Damp, quiet, the cars parked where they always were. The security guard from the night shift had taken a longer break and was back to rolling his wheelbarrow of cones. He greeted me like the world had been stitched back. I said nothing about the timestamp. I keep replaying the image that stopped me that night. The silver oval in the hospital windows, so clear and present in the glass, like something someone had decided to project because the night needed a center of attention. The sensible parts of me make lists. Reflections, refractions, a billboard light, my mind running off shift work. Those explanations sit in the mind like shoeboxes for receipts. But the rest of it, how every car in the lot shouted together and how everything settled the exact moment whatever it was left the roofline, doesn't quite fit into a box. I went home that morning and did laundry, and later that day, I checked the security footage at the nurse's station out of habit, because we all do that now when something odd happens. The clip around 3:08 shows the lot, an empty rectangle of rain-slick asphalt, a smear of white where something clipped the camera for a fraction of a second, then silence. No shape, no craft. The timestamps are smudged for 9 minutes like ink left out in the rain. The footage doesn't answer anything. It kind of refuses to be useful. If you ask me what I think it was, I'd tell you I don't know. I know I walked past the chapel. I know the shoes were still there, dry now in the morning sun. I know the alarms went off, and the whole parking lot made a single metallic noise and then stopped. I know the reflection in the glass showed something silver drifting above the roof, and when I turned around, the sky didn't have it. I know I drove home and made coffee and watched the sky until dawn. I am here. I came home. I am writing this between shifts, and I look up when I pass the hospital at night now. I don't expect it to return. I just look because I can, and because sometimes the world hands you a thing that won't fold neatly back into normal, and the only honest thing to do is watch for it. The ground under my sleeping pad started to hum before anything else did. I woke because the vibration was insistent enough to move my elbow in the tent. It wasn't the soft, regular weight of a passing truck on the distant forest road. This was thin and steady, like a bass note pressed into earth. I lay there for a second, thinking it was a rainstorm or my imagination, then unzipped the flap and peered out. The treetops were leaning the same way. Not a breeze, not a gust, not that random rustle you get when a squirrel runs along a branch. Every crown on the ridge across the creek angled in the same direction and held. The leaves didn't shimmer. They held that tilt like someone had tilted the whole forest to one side. My headlamp beam skimmed the pine needles and they didn't move except to reflect the light back. Above them, a long, pale glow was sliding across the sky. It wasn't a dot or a flash. It was a soft, stretched light, maybe the shape of a canoe if a canoe were blown up and lit from inside. It moved slow in one clean glide without edges, more a suggestion of something than a form. Silent. No rumble, no wing wash, nothing. The reflection of it made the creek look like it was breathing white under the dark. The ground under my pad vibrated in time with that light, a faint pulse through the soil that sounded like a far-off train if you put your ear to the rail. My name's Nate. I'd hiked up into the Laurel Hollow area for 2 nights by myself. No signal, no one at the parking lot, the sort of trip you take to get a clean head. I'd set the tent on a small bench near a tributary because it was flat and I liked the sound of the water. I knew the route. Creek, switchback, the ridge, then down to where the old logging road flattened. I'd locked the car, walked in at dusk, saw 1 or 2 other headlamps far off on a different spur. Nothing out of the ordinary until a dozen small things that are easy to ignore stacked in a row and made a pattern. Before I set up, there had been the deer. I cut across a meadow and 5 of them froze in the brush like cutouts. Not running, not startled, just statues with their heads turned the same direction. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds while my heart did that slow thud thing, and then one blinked and they melted into the trees, and that was that. I chalked it up to the way deer are. Then there was the headlamp I passed on the way in. I heard the rustle at the shelter ridge, and the beam swung once and died like someone had dropped their batteries. I called out and got nothing back. Later that night, I walked by the same spot and the lamp was gone. No footprint, no dropped pack, nothing. When I reached camp, I found my small compass lying in the tent vestibule with the needle dancing like a drunk. Not a slow wobble, full spins 10 degrees back, then another snap. I'd had that compass since college. It wasn't fragile. I blamed it on the magnet in the stove lid, but the stove was in the bag and the bag had been zipped when I left. It calmed eventually, but I remembered it because it felt like the world was making small exceptions to its own rules. The stream that night was louder than I expected, but sound was doing weird things everywhere. Some of the owls were quiet, and the frogs stopped altogether at 11 when I looked at my watch. I assumed a cold front had moved in. The clouds had been thick earlier, broken now into a dark river of sky, low like someone had folded the heavens. The weather app on my phone didn't load. I didn't expect it to, but the barometer on my little handheld read steady, which made the sudden silence all the more notable. The glow kept sliding. It moved just outside the tree line, following the ridge. It didn't blink, it didn't sharpen, just flowed like a slow tide. The breath in my chest kept catching because everything else that normally says, "This is fine," the leaves, the insects, the damn creek, had become an audience frozen in a theater. I unzipped the tent all the way and crawled out in my socks. The dirt underfoot was cool, and when I crouched down, I could feel the vibration clearer. It wasn't like a single thump. It was a steady, double-tap pulse that ran along the root lines and made the grass hum. My phone screen stayed black when I tapped it. No camera, no map, nothing. No bars, which is normal up there, but it felt wrong to be so cut off with something like that overhead. I made a stupid decision. I grabbed the little binoculars from the pack. Up close, the glow didn't show structure. You couldn't tell if it was something big far away or something thin and close. The edges were soft, and it moved as if it were being pulled on a string with a gardener's patience. When I held the lenses steady, my breath fogged the glass, and for a second a smear of my own breathing covered half the view, and I saw nothing but the smear, and then the glow was gone, swallowed by the night. The treetops dropped back, and the undergrowth started making their normal sounds, a cautious return like fingers unclenching. That loss, both the suddenness of the vanishing and the way my watch seemed to read a time that didn't match what I remembered, was what stayed with me most. I checked the watch because I always do. It read 1:04 a.m. I blinked and thought, no, I'd sat up earlier at midnight for a second, had looked at it, and it said 12:46. When I checked again, my watch slid calmly to 1:05, as if nothing odd had happened. Time felt elastic in that moment, like a rubber band pulled then let go. I didn't start hiking out until first light, partly because I wanted daylight to make me braver, and partly because I thought maybe I dreamt it. The route down felt normal at first. The creek, the rooty switchbacks, the blazes on the oaks, but the forest kept giving me small signs that something had been there. My trail marker tape, bright orange, was gone from a spot I'd tied one to for later sighting, and in its place the bark had a narrow scratch like a fingernail across a ledger. I found another marker a quarter-mile on, lodged in the crotch of a sapling, folded around like someone had retied it and left. No footprints, no trash, just those odd, precise little rearrangements. I met one other person coming up as I was heading out, an older woman with a day pack and a dog. She waved and said good morning like we do in places where people know each other's faces. "You camping?" she asked. I'll tell you how I answered. I shrugged and said yeah. Just a quick overnight. She didn't press. Later, she told a story to whoever would listen about lights she'd seen years ago and how animals react, and I thought about stopping her to ask if she'd noticed anything the night before, but I didn't. There's a way people tell certain things. They look at you with the expectation you'll nod, and then they move on. Maybe she'd seen this once and filed it under anomalies. The descent back to the car took longer than it should have. Somewhere on the old logging bridge, I had to stop because both my knees felt like they'd been pinged by a bolt of cold. The air tasted different, like it had been filtered, and my chest kept fluttering in a way that made me check my pulse a stupid number of times. The radio in the parking lot, the one on my friend's truck that I used to check the weather, was static when I flicked it on. I sat for a few minutes just watching for other cars. By the time I drove out of the forest and onto the paved county road, it was nearly noon. The sun had burned off the low cloud in bands, and the sky looked ordinary. I remember glancing at the tree line from the car window, and the pines looked smaller somehow, as if the night had inflated them, then deflated them. I texted my sister when I hit a signal island up on the highway, told her I was coming home a day early. Her reply was what you expect. Good, bring coffee. I almost called her and said, don't go into the Laurel Hollow if you can avoid it. But I didn't. How do you put the words together without sounding like a half-formed thing? Driving home, the funny aftermath set in. A kind of alert curiosity that kept me aware of every passing shadow and streetlight. At a gas station, I checked the footage on a dash cam, and there was nothing but my truck, the timestamp, and then a short blank white frame that appeared at the exact period when the glow had passed. The clerk shrugged when I asked, said his camera sometimes hiccuped. He didn't spend the kind of money to look for the hiccup. I didn't push. That night, in my apartment, I lay awake until 2 a.m., lights off, listening for the hum that had once run under me. There was nothing but the building's machinery. The elevator, a pipe clanging occasionally when someone above took a shower. The planets were clear in the window. I thought about going back the next weekend with someone, a friend who knows how to handle the dark, but the idea of the routine of a second trip felt wrong, as if by replaying it I'd break something sealed. I told two friends about it in the week after, one that I go hiking with a lot and one who's obsessed with weather anomalies. They both had soft ways of deflecting. Maybe it was lenticular clouds. Maybe you were really tired. The weather friend said the treetops could look like that with certain microbursts, and the watch could be a glitch. I didn't say the binoculars showed nothing when the glass fogged. I didn't say the vibration was like a note under the ground. I left out how the river looked when that light's reflection passed, like something had smoothed its skin and then gone. Weeks pass, and you tuck things away. You unpack the moment, fold it into your usual narrative like a stray receipt in a wallet. But the habit stuck. I look up at the sky more than I used to. Sometimes at the edge of night, I will stand on my balcony and watch cloud banks crawl and wait, stupidly, as if I've trained my eye to a cue. Most of the time, there's nothing but light pollution and the drone of traffic. I went back to Laurel Hollow last month during the day, walked the ridge, checked the trees. The orange marker tapes I'd hung were where I'd left them. The old logging bridge had a new plank. Someone had been there. The scratch on the bark is still there, thin and pale, like a scar on a hand. I run my thumb over it and it feels ordinary. Just healed wood. No one I spoke with had at that moment seen anything odd. They'd heard the usual stories about lights over the county, not one specific recollection, just a sense that the place carriers old events. So that's it. I went up for a night, something odd crawled the sky, and the forest behaved like an audience that forgot how to breathe. I came home. I sleep in a bed that doesn't hum under it. I make coffee in the morning and drive to work and pay attention to small things that used to drift by me. I don't have a tidy explanation. I don't have footage anyone reliable would accept. I have the memory of treetops leaning together and a pale, long light sliding silent across clouds while the ground under my tent pulsed like a bass note. That memory lives with the rest of the things you try to shrug off but find yourself checking for anyway, the way something that shouldn't happen did, and how everything resumed as if some rule had been paused and then resumed, leaving a space in your day where it had been. I was wiping down the fender of a 2001 F-150, the garage lights making the red paint look almost too clean when something moved across the hood. Not a shadow, not a tool dropping, just a ripple, like someone had thrown a finger across the surface of water. My rag froze mid-swipe. I looked up and the ceiling light behind me caught in the reflection, and for a second the truck seemed to bend toward me, edges wavering like heat rising off asphalt in July. Only it wasn't hot, it was late February, and the garage heater had been humming quietly for hours. My name's Leo. I run a small auto shop just off Main Street in Cedarville. Usually it's quiet at night. Most folks bring their cars in the morning or the weekend. But every few weeks, someone rolls in late, and I stay behind to finish work. That night, I was the last car in, a brake job for a neighbor's truck. Nothing fancy. I had music playing low, windows cracked just enough for the February air to sneak in, and the fluorescent lights buzzing in that way they do when they're about to flicker. At first, I thought it was my own reflection messing with me. I reached over, touched the hood, solid metal, and the ripple vanished. I leaned back, wiped my hands on a rag, and the feeling didn't go away. The air looked wrong, like it had a weight it shouldn't have. I glanced at the overhead fluorescent and noticed it seemed to shimmer slightly, edges wavy, even though the bulbs themselves were fine. It reminded me of when I'd see the horizon bend over hot asphalt during summer runs to the lake, but it was cold. I shook my head and told myself I'd been staring at the hood too long. That's when I noticed the shadows of the cars outside the garage doors didn't match the streetlights. They stretched and bent where they shouldn't have. One moment the light hit the crown of the truck, and the next it seemed to curl upward, bending around a shape I couldn't identify. I got that tickle behind my neck, the one that tells you to look away but also says you can't. I went over to the workbench to grab a flashlight. When I turned back, the entire ceiling of the garage seemed to ripple, not like a curtain in the wind, but like the air itself was bending in slow waves. I leaned against the truck for balance, heart starting to race. My eyes caught the reflection in the F-150's hood again, and this time it wasn't just a ripple. It looked like the surface of the hood was vibrating in slow motion, the edges of the lights above stretching into faint arcs. The cold air had that metallic tang you sometimes get in a snowstorm, but it was stronger, like it was thickening the room. I stepped back, and then the music I had playing, a low, bluesy track, stuttered, warped for a moment, like a record spinning unevenly. My phone on the workbench did the same thing. The screen glitched, then went black for a few seconds before rebooting. I muttered something under my breath, thinking about the wiring in the garage, maybe the fluorescent flicker affecting the circuits. But the breaker box looked normal. The fuse is all fine, nothing unusual. The air grew heavier. I swear I could feel it pressing slightly down, the way air feels before a heavy snowstorm. And then the ripples on the truck started moving independently of the lights above, sliding across the metal like liquid metal. My flashlight caught a glint from the ceiling, and the beam seemed to bend slightly as it passed through the air. I tilted the beam, tried to track it, and the shimmer followed, always just beyond direct sight. I grabbed the keys to my car and stepped outside. The night was cold, calm. The street was empty. The garage door's shadow stretched across the asphalt, normal. But the sky above the building wasn't. It hung there like a curtain of heat haze, wavering, trembling with faint silver distortions. I squinted, rubbing my eyes, and saw faint streaks, slender, pale lines that moved slowly across the sky in impossible directions, straight up and back down again, like the air itself was rolling over something. I pulled my jacket tighter and stepped to the edge of the lot. A car drove by, its headlights cutting cleanly through the distortion. The shimmer stayed above the garage. When the car passed, the light from its beams bent slightly as it entered the warped patch, stretching in weird lines, then snapped normal once it was past. I felt a pull to watch, like my brain couldn't let the anomaly go, but I also felt a deep unease, a warning I couldn't name. I called my friend, Tom, who's been an amateur astronomer forever, and told him to look at the sky over Cedarville if he was up. He said nothing at first, then, Leo. That's, I don't know, man, maybe just Aurora solar storm? I laughed nervously. Aurora in February, in Illinois? He didn't answer. By the time I decided to go back inside and lock the shop up, the shimmer had faded slowly, like steam rising off a cold street after a brief sun. The hood of the F-150 looked normal again. The fluorescent lights buzzed in their usual way. Everything seemed normal, except for the heavy feeling in my chest, the faint metallic tang in the air, and the vague memory that the air above the garage hadn't obeyed gravity for a little while. I drove home slowly, doors locked, windows up. In my driveway, I stepped out, and the sky overhead looked perfectly normal, the stars faint through high clouds. Nothing to see, nothing to explain. But I knew what I'd seen, felt, and I kept catching myself glancing at the garage from the end of the street. The next morning, everything seemed as it should. No traces, no physical evidence. The metal on the truck was cool and solid. The heater was just humming. But I remembered the ripple, the shimmer, the air bending like liquid above the ceiling, and the way my skin had felt like it was vibrating in time with something I couldn't see. I've gone back to that garage plenty of nights since. Nothing ever happened again. The tools are still lined up the same, the trucks sit where I left them. The fluorescent lights buzz normally, the air feels cold, empty, normal. But every once in a while, late at night, I swear I see the metal surfaces flicker with a hint of motion. Just a hint, like a memory of what was up there, hovering and bending the night sky itself. I pulled off the county road and killed the engine because the sky was doing that slow, wrong thing where everything feels like it's holding its breath. My name's Mason, and I chase storms on the weekends for whatever money freelance clips bring in, and because I can't stand sitting on the couch while a wall cloud does something interesting an hour away. That day in late May, the air south of town was thick and hot and smelled like iron, the kind of heat that makes the whole horizon sag. I'd been tailing the cell all afternoon, passing pickup trucks and farmers who waved like we were all in on something. I parked on the side where you can see the field flatten and the corn rows shimmer. I set the dash cam on the hood and watched the base. Small odd things started first. The swallows that had been hunting the insects over the drainage ditch vanished all at once like somebody closed a curtain. The county radio on my passenger seat hissed, then gave me an odd squeal like a tape rewinding and went quiet for a beat, long enough to make me check the connection. My phone flashed no service for a second and then came back with 3 bars like nothing had happened. It's that kind of chasing. Small glitches that you try to explain with weather jargon, but that still make your skin prickle. The wall clouds sagged lower. The wind had that tight metallic smell and the corn bent in waves like a sea. I put the camera on the windshield mount and ran the lens through its usual scrub, clean enough to record the look of a storm as if the angle matters later. The lip of the base rolled and a little dust spun at ground level, and I thought, this could tighten. A farmer in an old pickup parked at the shoulder and watched with me. He tipped his cap and said nothing, which is the polite way country folks tell you to keep the back seat of fear. The funnel came down thin and quick, roping toward the soil. It wasn't dramatic the way TV makes it out to be. It was a machine of condensation, slow and patient, stretching toward the ground like taffy. The dash cam caught the motion, columns of dust punching up. Trucks on the far road dimmed their headlights and a dog stopped yapping in a yard. That silence is a real part of storms. It's an intake before the world rearranges itself. Then I saw the lights. They were inside the column, maybe halfway up, 3 of them, fixed. Not strobes, not navigation lights, not the wobble of aircraft. Just 3 steady points arranged roughly like a triangle, 1 near the bottom and 2 above. The rotation of the funnel should have torn anything to shreds. Instead, those lights leveled themselves with the pipe and didn't move. They weren't blinding, just sharp, white, like LEDs you can hold in your hand. The sight looked wrong in a precise way, like seeing a bookmark in a washing machine. I zoomed the camera and got out of the car because I wanted the angle and the sound. Sitting in the car felt like peeking through glass. The wind hit like a wall, and I felt the sting of grit in my face. I remember thinking I would get better footage if I kept my breath normal, like that would steady the hands. The dashcam's audio picked up the gusts and the farmer's radio 2 fields over calling something about cell moving quick, but it didn't pick up anything extra. No mechanical whine, no whir of rotors. Just the regular storm noise layered with this impossible calm inside the funnel. A bolt slashed from the cloud to the field to my left. It was the kind of lightning that makes your teeth feel like they want to rearrange. The 3 lights went out the instant the flash hit. No dimming, no stagger, just gone. In the camera, the frames show a white flash and then empty space where the bright points had been. The funnel kept spinning. The dust still rose. The lights had been inside it like beads on a wire and then nothing. I reflexively blinked, and my eyes felt like they'd had sand in them for a second. People call after a strike, and this time the calls came in quick. Other chasers texted short clips, exclamation marks, coordinates. Someone else had a dash cam that captured a tandem view, and the lights show on the frames there, too. Same pattern, same instant of disappearance, when the flash hits. We traded shaky footage and timestamps like kids swapping baseball cards. The dispatcher patched in with weather service numbers asking for reports of debris or damage, but the ground reports were mostly the expected. Flattened corn, a broken fence post, a leaning silo in the next township. No houses blown away, no injuries, nothing to pin the lights to. I kept watching after the flash because maybe they'd come back, maybe the strike had just shocked whatever was holding them. The funnel moved off the field and the rotation wobbled out as the gust front passed. The radio that had hissed earlier now fed me a stream of chatter, another crew calling coordinates, the county asking about power lines. My camera files had a few frames where you could see the triangle if you froze it, and then nothing. The farmer who'd been parked leaned out of his truck and swore quietly that he'd seen a weird light and that his kid had filmed it on a phone. He didn't seem afraid, just, I don't know, unsettled in the way folks get when the world does something it doesn't usually do. After the chase, I drove home slow and kept thinking about how precise the lights had been, how steady they held inside a thing designed to shred. At the house, I uploaded the raw footage and watched it on the laptop, pausing and zooming and trying to find any artifact that could explain the points. Reflection off hail, sun glancing off a metallic object, lens flare. The experts I know sent back cautious emails, glints off ice, a sensor error. One meteorologist friend called it interesting and asked if I'd send him the timestamps. He didn't laugh at the frames. He didn't have an answer either. In the morning, the field looked like any field that had seen a funnel, flattened rows and some broken posts. The farmer stood with a paper cup of coffee and said he slept in the cellar because that's what you do when the sky looks like it might rearrange. He told me his kids' video showed the lights too. There were the usual explanations offered in town: mirrors, drones, optical trickery, but none of them fit the exactness of what I'd seen. 3 points holding steady against spinning wind, and then gone the moment lightning struck. I kept the files, not as proof but as the record of an event that didn't line up with ordinary things. I kept watching the frames when I couldn't sleep. The 3 lights frozen like beads and then erased by a white flash. I don't have a tidy answer. I have a camera, a farmer's testimony, other chasers' shaky clips, and a memory that keeps replaying the same precise wrongness. 3 steady lights holding their ground inside a moving column, and the way they vanished the instant the sky slammed a bolt through them. I had the night shift at the lot for 3 months before anything like that happened, which is to say I knew every dull corner of the place. My name's Ray. I sat in a little trailer with a space heater, 3 dead houseplants, and a coffee maker that was more decoration than appliance. The lot belonged to an old strip mall that never came back after the developer folded. There were a few chain link fences, a broken sign that still read, "Coming soon" in flaking letters, and a bank of CCTV monitors that let me pretend I was watching something important. On a slow night, my job was half boredom and half routine. Check the cameras every 20 minutes, sweep the lot around midnight, log anything weird in the book, call dispatch if someone was trespassing. I knew the routes of the raccoons and the places the stray cats liked to sun themselves at dawn. I knew when the bus came by on its last loop and when some kid would try to skip through the lot on his skateboard. Mostly, nothing happened. There were small, odd things that week, the kind you shrug off because the world never runs perfectly. One camera in the northwest corner had been flickering for 2 nights, a little vertical tear down the feed, static that would stretch across the screen and then settle. The motion sensor by the back gate pinged twice in the morning with no footage. Once, the parking lot lights dimmed for a beat and then came back bright. The maintenance crew blamed the city grid and wrote it on a sticky note. My radio picked up 3 seconds of a voice I couldn't make out, like someone speaking underwater, and then went to clear static. Those were the things you logged and forgot. On Tuesday around 3 in the morning, I was scrolling through the feeds because the heater had died and the trailer was cold and my hands needed something to do. The main monitor was split into 4. On the lower right tile, the one that pointed at the central row of empty stalls, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a shadow, a trick of light. But the motion was steady, slow, deliberate. Something that ate 3 camera frames to move the width of a parking space. It looked like a shape more than anything. Not a person. The edges were soft, like a sheet dragged over a frame. It hovered maybe a foot off the ground and drifted across the asphalt without making the car's reflections twitch. The shadow didn't cast other shadows. It simply moved over them. The CCTV showed no soundbar, of course, no audio, but I could hear my own blood in my ears like it was trying to compete with nothing. I rewound the footage 10 seconds and played it slower. The shape kept its pace, slow enough that you could read the parking spot lines as it passed them. It didn't have a color, really, more like an absence inside the grainy night feed. The timestamp crawled along the bottom. 18. No brakes. I hit the pan tilt controls to get the other cameras looking where it was headed. No camera caught it from another angle. It simply glided off the right edge of that tile like it walked through a seam in the world. I stood up too fast and knocked my coffee cup. It rattled and then stopped. My hands went to the radio without me thinking. Dispatch. This is lot 29er. I'm advised of movement on camera 3, I said. My voice sounded small. Static filled my ear for a second, then the dispatcher answered in his sleepy, clipped tone. Copy lot 29er. Do you have visual? I told him what I saw and asked for backup. he told me he'd send a unit to circle the lot, that I should step outside and check. Standard procedure, soft and bland. I grabbed my flashlight and my badge and stepped out. The night hit like someone closing a door, colder than trailer air, cleaner. The lot smelled faintly like oil and pine sap. The lights over the row glared down, white and ordinary. I walked to the nearest camera pole and swept the beam of my flashlight across the asphalt, checking every concrete wheel stop, every empty cart corral. There was nothing. No tarp, no discarded blanket, no person crouched behind a planter. My breath worked in my chest like a small motor. My radio chattered that a cruiser was 10 minutes away, and the dispatcher asked me to watch from a safe distance. I walked along the central aisle where the shape had been. The headlight halos cut the air into bright bands. I shone the light under the cars. I felt ridiculous checking under a late-model sedan for a thing I couldn't even describe, but that's the job. Cover the bases so someone else doesn't have to. Near stall 7, I noticed a small circle in the dust on the asphalt. It was darker where it had been rubbed or compressed and had a perfect circumference, maybe the size of a hubcap. It wasn't a footprint. It didn't have a smear or shoe tread. It looked like a tidy thumbprint on a dusty table. I crouched and ran a gloved finger around the edge, but the dust clung. Nothing came away. There were no tracks leading to it, no drag marks. The shape could have been made by a can or a cover, except I couldn't find anything that fit. I checked the camera monitor again from the pole with my light. The feed showed the stall empty in the same angle, the timestamp moving on. I rewound to the second the shape passed and played it frame by frame. The scene on the monitor matched what I was looking at in real life, except for the phantom shape. On the screen, it drifted out of view. On the asphalt, all I had was that neat circle in the dust. The cruiser rolled in slow, and the officer clicked his flashlight around. He took the report, wrote something on his notepad, and asked if I had seen anyone hiding. I described the footage and the dust circle. He asked if I'd checked the fences. I said I'd walked the perimeter twice that night. He radioed the shift and left a patrol to circle the area. He didn't laugh. He didn't seem surprised beyond the level of professional curiosity. We all had a job to do and an evening to get through. I slept in the trailer a little. The heater wouldn't kick, and the thin blanket I kept on the fold-out couch did more to keep my shoulders warm than the heater ever did. My dreams were empty boxes and the sound of a projector clicking film. By dawn, I had coffee in hand and my bones in motion. The patrol gave me their file number and the sergeant's card, and then they were gone, the cruiser slipping down the access road like any other night. At 8 o'clock, the janitor, Luis, showed up to sweep the lot. He had the sort of face that does not flinch easily, 10 years on this shift and a gentle reserve that refuses drama. I told him about the shape and the circle, and he nodded slowly, squinting at the morning sun as if light might reveal what the CCTV couldn't. He walked the asphalt and picked at the circle with his broom, and then stopped and shook his head. It was washed clean by the morning dew, he said. He swept the dust away like it was a stain. We both watched the sweep and the brush kick up little puffs of dust that relieved whatever skin of oddness covered the place. The janitor's broom made the asphalt look normal again, the way a broom makes a floor seem ordinary. I took the footage to dispatch, and they archived it with a terse, unidentified object label. They said sometimes cameras caught insects close to the lens or lens flare, and sometimes pixels misbehaved. They asked if I'd check the hardware. I did. The camera was fine. Its lens had no insects, and the casing sealed tight. I went home in daylight, thinking about the clean circle that had resisted both broom and explanation, about the way the shape moved without sound and without touching. My wife, Kara, worked afternoons at the bookstore and was asleep on the couch when I walked in, a half-finished paperback on her chest. I made coffee and set the kettle to go because routine helps stitch weird nights back into ordinary lives. She asked me how the graveyard shift went, and I said, slow until early morning, and left it at that. There are things you tell and things you keep. She didn't ask the details, and I didn't press them on her. That week, people called the lot weird in little ways. Kids dared each other to set their skateboards on the cracked pavement. A night driver posted a shaky clip online of something blurry over a parking space, and the comments tried to make sense of it with jokes and explanations. The management company sent a tech out, replaced the camera, re-aimed a few lenses. They wrote maintenance in the log and closed the incident as resolved. Sometimes late at night now, when I sit in the trailer and the heater hums and everything is routine, I pull the footage back up on the monitor and watch that soft, impossible shape glide across the parking lines. I pause it where the object sits above stall 7, and I compare the paused frame to the actual asphalt outside the window. The images match, except for the thing in the frame and for the circle in the dust that the broom could entirely erase in my head. I am alive, my wife is calling me to supper, and the lot is empty more often than not. I can't say what I saw. I can only tell you that the cameras recorded it. My feet found a circle on the pavement, and the world went on like nothing odd had happened. The wind was gusting across the desert when I got to the south perimeter of the base that night. It was mid-March 2018, and even though the days were warming up, nights still carried that sharp, dry chill that creeps under your jacket. I'd been working the night shift for almost a year by then, doing maintenance and monitoring equipment near the fences. Most nights were quiet, sometimes too quiet, but this was something else. I was sitting in the little portable shack with my partner Luis, logging sensor readings when it started. Faint at first, like someone calling out from far away, barely audible over the wind. I tilted my head. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Luis paused, pencil midair over the log sheet. "Hear what?" "That screaming?" "Or something like it, out there." I pointed toward the flat expanse of desert beyond the chain link fence. He frowned, squinting into the darkness. "Could be coyotes." I shook my head. "No, coyotes don't sound like that. It's human." We sat quietly for a moment, straining to hear. The wind shifted and the sound came again. Higher pitched, wavering, fading in and out, carried on the desert gusts. It wasn't constant, more like bursts, sometimes overlapping, almost echoing across the empty terrain. Luis finally grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Patrol Unit 3. We think we're hearing something outside the perimeter, possibly on the east side. Can we get a sweep?" "Unit 3, proceed with caution. Copy." "ETA for reinforcements 5 minutes," came the calm, clipped reply. By the time the other patrol arrived, the sound had stopped. We fanned out along the fence line, flashlights cutting across the dark brush and uneven washes. Nothing. No tracks, no footprints, no evidence of anyone being out there. The desert was untouched except for our own footprints in the sand. I checked the motion sensors along the fence. All clear. Thermal cams. Nothing. Not a single warm body. And yet that screaming, that sound of someone calling, had been real. I hadn't imagined it. Luis agreed. We stayed out there for another hour, walking slow, circling, trying to find the source. Every now and then the wind carried faint echoes, soft enough that you almost convinced yourself it was nothing. But then it would rise again, like someone right on the edge of hearing, just beyond the fence. By the time we returned to the shack, the air had cooled sharply. I leaned against the wall, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. Luis just lit a cigarette, puffing quietly. Neither of us spoke for a while. Over the next few nights, the same thing happened. Around 1 a.m., sometimes 2, faint screams riding the desert wind. Always coming from outside the perimeter, always impossible to locate. Patrols would search, sweep, run thermal cams, check motion sensors. Nothing. The recordings we kept on the comms channels never picked it up, at least not clearly. Just static with occasional brief peaks that sounded like voices, distorted and fleeting. One night, I stayed longer, sitting outside the shack with my back to the wind, watching the ridges in the distance. I started noticing movement, or what I thought was movement, at the edge of my peripheral vision. Shadows shifting across the desert floor, but when I turned, nothing. Just sand, rocks, and low scrub. I began keeping a personal log, noting wind direction, temperature, approximate time, anything I thought might correlate with the sound. No pattern emerged. Sometimes it was calm, other nights gusting hard, sometimes coming from the north, sometimes from the south. Always fleeting, always gone before you could pin it down. Luis quit a few months after that. He said he couldn't handle the tension, the constant sense of being watched, the way the sound would seem to follow him. I didn't blame him. Even now, when I think about it, I get that same uneasy pull in my chest. remembering how impossible it was to feel safe when the screams came, even inside the shack. The base higher-ups never mentioned it officially. There were whispers, brief conversations in hushed tones, but nothing concrete. Some of the newer patrols joked about hearing the ghost screams, but we all knew better. It wasn't a joke. I left that post eventually, moved back closer to Vegas. I still hear it sometimes in my dreams, the thin, wavering sound of someone calling, lost in the wind. And even now, years later, when I drive out on a deserted desert highway at night and the wind picks up, I glance toward the empty ridges, half expecting to hear that same faint voice carried across the open sand. Nothing follows me. Nothing chases me. But the memory of it, the strangeness of hearing something that shouldn't be there, the knowledge that patrols found nothing, stays. And I don't know what it was. I only know that it happened over and over and that it could vanish so completely that official records, sensors, and cameras never noticed a thing. I was a contractor at Area 51 back in 2011, mostly doing routine electrical work and maintenance on some of the older hangars out near the northern end of the base. I'd done nights before, but this one was late summer and the heat had dropped enough that the desert didn't feel like it was trying to cook you alive. I had my tools, a small flashlight, and my truck parked just outside the main door of Hangar 7. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened during my day shift, and I was looking forward to finishing the wiring and heading home. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I got the call from my point of contact, a civilian engineer named Carson. He needed me to check some wiring in a section of the hangar that had been decommissioned for years. I didn't think much of it. Old hangars got repurposed all the time. The place smelled like metal and concrete dust, with a faint trace of ozone that I assumed came from the emergency backup generators. I switched on my flashlight and started moving along the main corridor of Hangar 7. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off machinery I didn't recognize, and stacks of crates labeled with codes I wasn't supposed to know. My boots echoed against the concrete floor. That's when I saw it, or thought I did. There was a figure at the far end of the hangar, moving between the rows of crates. It looked humanoid, tall and thin, but the details were fuzzy, like a heat shimmer on asphalt. At first, I figured it was another worker or one of the base security officers doing a patrol. "Hey!" I called out. Nothing. The shape continued moving smoothly, almost gliding. I moved closer, trying to get a better look. My flashlight beam swept over the floor between me and the figure. No footprints. The concrete was bare, the dust undisturbed. That didn't make sense. I stopped, shining the light directly at the shape. For a moment, it seemed to pause, like it had noticed me. Then it moved again, disappearing behind a row of machinery. I turned on my radio. "Carson, did you or anyone else just walk through the North Bay?" Silence. I tried again, louder. "Hello?" No reply. The radio crackled normally, but the control center didn't respond. My stomach tightened. I walked toward the end of the hangar slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The shape didn't reappear, and there was still no trace of it on the floor. I thought maybe it had been a shadow or a trick of the light, but my flashlight cut through the darkness clearly, and nothing else looked like it could cast that kind of shadow. By then, my nerves were on edge. I moved through the hangar, checking behind machinery and crates. Every step echoed. My own shadow danced across the walls, but there was nothing else, nothing that could account for the shape I'd seen. I reached the area where I was supposed to do the wiring. Everything seemed normal, but the air had a strange quality, almost heavier than usual, like it was pressing against me. I knelt down to check the connections, trying to calm myself. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from the far side of the hangar. Not loud, more like metal sliding slowly across concrete. I froze. My flashlight beam swung in the direction of the sound. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just a crate shifting or an old door settling. I continued working, but every now and then I'd glance up, half expecting to see the shape again. A few minutes later, I did. It was at the far end again, standing between two pieces of machinery. Same tall, thin, humanoid form. I called out once more. Nothing. I tried waving my flashlight. The shape didn't react. Then, as I watched, it moved slightly, then vanished again, leaving the concrete floor entirely bare. No footprints, no dust disturbed. I decided to finish quickly. The wiring was simple, but I couldn't focus. Every sound echoed too sharply. Every shadow seemed alive. I packed up my tools and started toward the exit. As I got closer to the main hangar door, I noticed something else. The temperature felt cooler, despite the summer heat outside. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. That made no sense. The doors were open to the outside air, but it was dry, warm desert night air. My breath shouldn't have fogged like that. I stepped outside, the desert sky dark with a few scattered stars. My truck was where I'd left it. I glanced back toward the hangar. The doorway was empty. Nothing moved inside. I drove back toward the main base complex, lights dimmed to avoid detection by security cameras. The next day, I asked Carson if anyone else had been in Hangar 7 the night before. "Nope," he said. "You were the only one." I hesitated but didn't mention the shape. He'd probably think I was joking, or worse, that I'd lost it. Over the next few nights, I kept seeing strange things, mostly small stuff at first. Shadows that didn't match objects, faint hums of machinery in decommissioned areas, the occasional flicker of light where none should be. I told myself it was fatigue, stress, the desert messing with my mind. Then I saw it again. I was in a different hangar, checking the HVAC system late at night. I caught movement from the corner of my eye, a tall, thin figure moving smoothly across the floor. My flashlight swept over it. Nothing. The floor was clean, no footprints, no dust disturbed. I called out. Nothing. After that, I started avoiding those sections of the hangars whenever possible. I worked quickly, never lingering, and I never mentioned the shape to anyone else. I wasn't ready to be laughed at, and I wasn't ready to be reassigned to some new evaluation program. Years later, I still think about that hangar. I don't know what I saw, and I never got a straight answer. The concrete was untouched, cameras recorded nothing, and the shape didn't leave a trace. But I know what I saw with my own eyes. I can still picture the form, gliding silently between machinery, disappearing without a sound or a mark. Sometimes I drive out near the desert, away from lights and towns, and I swear I catch glimpses of it again, tall, thin, moving just at the edge of my vision. And just like before, when I blink, it's gone. No footprints, no evidence, nothing to prove it was ever there. I came home that night alive and unharmed, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that hangar, and whatever it wasn't human. I was on the porch because the house felt too still inside. It had been one of those long days at the clinic. Back-to-back appointments, charts to fill out, the kind of small nagging errors that make you check a patient's name twice. I left my bag by the door, poured a glass of something iced and weak, and settled into the swing with a blanket over my knees. It was late May, warm enough that the nights hung soft, but cool enough that you wanted a little something over your legs. The porch light cast that familiar yellow pool over the steps. The rest of the yard dissolved into hedges and the big maple that leans toward the fence. At first, nothing was odd. The neighborhood was whispering. Somewhere a TV murmured through an open window. A distant car passed, a dog barked twice, and then went on with its night. The little radio on the kitchen counter had been set to low earlier, and its tinny voice floated out the back window for a bit, then faded as people turned off screens. I watch the sky because I do. It's a small ritual, a way to tell the day it's over. The moon was a sliver, and the first stars were pricking out like points on black velvet. I had Rosie, our old beagle, curled at my feet, nose tucked. She stirred sometimes and then settled. That's when the first small thing happened. The crickets that had been making a steady undercurrent of sound cut off. Not a fade out, more like someone snapped a hand over the band. One moment they were there, the next the yard felt like a room with the TV paused. I noticed it the way you notice when the refrigerator stops humming. It's such a minor absence it makes the whole house feel less certain. Rosie lifted her head and looked up at the maple, ears up in that anxious, listening way dogs have. She never did that without reason. I put my glass down and listened. For a while, there was nothing but the far highway and the faint thunk of a screen door down the block. I thought maybe wind had died away. That happens sometimes in the valleys. Little pockets of perfect stillness where the air holds. Then the porch bulb dimmed. Not a flicker or a pop, it softened like someone let the wattage down. The light pool across the steps thinned and a bar of the swing chair threw a longer shadow. I told myself the bulb was old and that I'd replace it in the morning. I told myself many small, sensible things that night. The porch light brightened again after a few heartbeats, steady and normal, and I settled back. A little later, the clock on the stove, the kind with green LED numbers, blipped. It jumped forward by 2 minutes, then back. The soundless tick of the kitchen clock settling felt oddly loud in a night that had lost its crickets. I picked up my phone to check the time. The screen showed a single bar and the tiny circle of searching that means the network was on vacation. My thumb hovered over the screen like I might prod it back into life. Rosie gave a small bark at the maple and stood up. She padded to the edge of the porch and peered into the yard, tail not wagging, just tense. I went with her and leaned on the rail. The sky glittered. The maple's leaves were black cutouts against it. You could see Orion if you knew where to look. I know because I used to drag my kids out to the park and name the shapes. A single star on the left side of the sky caught my eye. It was one of those first bright ones, maybe a planet even. It hung steady and white. I watched it for no reason other than habit. And then the star brightened. Not slowly, not like the way light seems to bloom when cloud thins. It brightened fast. In the space of a breath, it went from a distant pin to something like a small, very distant bulb turned up to a glare. The change was instantaneous enough that it felt like a cut. The whole yard filled with a soft, pale light that wasn't warm the way porch light is. It was cool, almost silver. It flattened colors into a high-contrast sketch. Roses that had been coral took on a hard white edge. The grass showed each blade like the slats of a paintbrush. When the light hit us, I felt the hairs along my forearms stand up. The air didn't change temperature. If anything, it felt a degree thinner, like the night had been sipped. The light was not a beam. It didn't have a cone or a focused source. It was like the sky had decided to be a lamp, and the lamp had been set on the map of my yard. Shadows sharpened immediately. The house across the street, dark and shuttered, looked as if someone had taken a photograph and pushed the exposure. Even Rosie's eyes reflected the silver in a way I'd never seen. The first thought was practical. Someone with a flashlight on the hill, a sport camera, a spotlight from a truck. But the glow didn't move like any of those things. It didn't come from the road. It came from the sky, up where stars live. It wasn't a plane. I would have heard a motor or seen strobes. There was no sound beyond the distant highway and that small, tight noise of my chest. I called my name out because calling your own name is a thing you can do when the night stretches and you want someone else to witness it, to fold it into normal. Evan, I said, come here. My husband's voice floated from the kitchen window where he'd been fixing something sensible. He always tucks tools away by the sink, and when he answered, I could hear his feet on the tile. I said, outside, now. It was stupidly abrupt, and I knew it, but I wanted him there. By the time he came to the door, the light had eased. The star had returned to its ordinary pin, and the yard had the same gold puddle on the steps from the porch bulb. Evan stepped out, rubbing his hands like he was cold, though the air wasn't. What? He started. The star, I said. It lit up the whole yard. My voice sounded very small. I had the sense of saying something that would make him fold it into a sensible story. Some electrical blip, neighborhood prank, but the tremor in my hands made me honest. He looked up where I'd been looking and squinted. The pinprick of the star was there, innocent and wrong. I don't see anything, he said after a second, like he might have missed the end of my sentence or the point altogether. He came closer and put an arm around my shoulders, the way he does when someone else is rattled. You sure you didn't just catch lightning or a plane? He asked. No, I said. It was bright. It lit everything, like daylight. I told him how the shadows had become sharp and how the roses looked white-edged. I told him Rosie had looked at the sky like she'd seen a person. He listened the way he always does, slow and available. And then, without meaning to sound unhelpful, he said, maybe your eyes were tired. We stood there in the cooling gold of the porch bulb, and I watched his face look for the practical thing. He was trying on reasons the same way someone tries on coats to see which fit. I wanted him to say, I saw it too, because shared witnesses make events less slippery. but he didn't. He only said, "Want me to check the street?" And I said yes. He walked to the edge of the yard, down the path, and leaned over the low fence. The street was the same as always, a parked car near the lamppost, a silhouette of a man walking his dog farther down, the soft orange of sodium lights. He checked over his shoulder and then came back without looking alarmed. "Nothing odd," he said. He tried the radio in the kitchen, flipped through channels. The tiny blue LED on the stove blinked its clock, the same numbers as before, 11:43, and didn't stutter. The router's little light kept blinking its polite pattern. My phone, which had shown 1 bar, came back to full signal as if the world had never been absent for a second. The porch bulb held steady. The sky, to everything else, behaved like an old friend. I kept thinking about the light while he made us tea. I kept replaying that instant where the yard went from ordinary to near daylight, and how the roses looked like they'd been sketched in white. I felt silly and small for being thrown by a blink of brightness, but a part of me had been unsettled in a way I couldn't name. The ordinary things of the house, mug handle, tea steam, the soft ticking of the clock, were a small, precise proof that the world had not ended, not even a little. We didn't tell anyone. Who would you tell? I thought of calling the neighbor who charts weather out of habit. I thought of the city police or an astronomer at the university, and then the practical pile formed again. You have patients in the morning, bills, a child's rehearsal. The list of what must be done shrank the night down to normal size. I wrote a note and left it in my phone. Saw a bright skylight, 11:38 p.m. No details, just a stub of evidence. That night I woke twice and went to the window because habit is an odd form of superstitious logic. The sky was the same as it had been before. Stars, moon bit in a sliver. Rosie slept in her crate, lungs slow and steady. The next evening, the news was full of a local council meeting about zoning, nothing about lights or sky phenomena. The week after that, I walked the yard in daylight and looked for any scorch on the grass, a melted leaf, anything to explain the intensity of the brightness. There was nothing unusual, just the ordinary tracks of the sprinklers and the faint ring where a bird had pecked last week. Sometimes I caught myself staring up, waiting for the star to flare like a hand turning a switch. I kept expecting some repeat, a pattern, a reason. Life resumed its usual steady sequence: work, dinner, the town routine. The note on my phone sat there like a small relic. Saw a bright skylight, 11:38 p.m. I read it sometimes, like reading an odd sentence someone else had written about the world. I don't have a tidy explanation. I only have the memory of that sudden high white light, the way it sharpened shadows and flattened color, and the fact that by the time Evan reached the porch, the sky had closed its mouth and resumed the business of being night. The garden looked the same as it always had, the roses no paler than before, and the maple's leaves resumed being nothing more than leaves against the sky. The event folded itself into the night with the quiet persistence of some things that don't need telling. I'd gone out that night just to get away from everything. My name's Lila, and I usually spend evenings on the back porch with a glass of wine, watching the stars. I live out in the hills near Ridgewood, a place far enough from city lights that the sky looks almost like someone spilled glitter over black velvet. That night was clear, unusually warm for late October, and there wasn't a cloud in sight. I leaned back in my old wooden chair, blanket around my shoulders, binoculars hanging around my neck, just looking up. I'd been tracking some of the brighter constellations, trying to memorize them, when I noticed a point of light that didn't fit. At first, I assumed it was a satellite, moving slowly like the others I occasionally catch. But then it jerked. Not a smooth movement. It darted, almost zigzagging, stopping abruptly like someone slammed the brakes on a tiny invisible car. Then it zipped again in another direction. I frowned, adjusting my binoculars. Nothing else in the sky was moving like that. My eyes darted around trying to catch anything else that could explain it. A plane, a drone, maybe even a shooting star. But this point of light was the only one, moving in ways that felt wrong, almost intelligent. I called my roommate, Mara, who's usually skeptical about anything weird. She came out, bundled in her hoodie, yawning. "What is it?" she asked. I pointed and she blinked. "Looks like a star." She squinted and I saw her frown as it jerked again. It's not a star, I said quietly. Stars don't move like that. Watch. We both stayed still, our breath visible in the cool air. It darted sideways, paused midair, then seemed to hover for a few seconds before moving again. The motion wasn't gradual, it was precise, almost deliberate. I rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was imagining it? But Mara hadn't said a word, and she doesn't usually indulge in my star obsessions. After a few minutes, it stopped again. Not just a pause, completely still, like it had landed on some invisible surface. My stomach tightened. I lifted the binoculars and focused on it. There was no glow aside from the pinprick of light, no heat distortion, no flicker of movement around it. Then it darted again, fast this time, across the horizon, almost invisible except for the lingering glow at the edges. I sat down heavily. Okay, that's not normal, I muttered. Mara just shook her head, looking slightly pale. Then it happened. I glanced away thinking I'd lost it, and when I looked back, it was back where it started. No motion in between, no blur, nothing. Just right there, twinkling like a regular star. I blinked, lowered the binoculars, and stared. My mind was spinning. How does something disappear like that? I felt my chest tighten. It was too fast to be a plane or satellite, too precise to be random. Mara's voice cut through my thoughts. Lila, it's still there, she said softly. I nodded. Yeah, I know. We stayed out for another hour, trying to track it, trying to see if it would move again. It didn't. The rest of the sky stayed quiet, stars blinking in their usual positions, a few planes passing far off, nothing unusual. Eventually we went inside, leaving the porch light off. I kept glancing back through the window, but the star was steady, ordinary. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, some small cue that would explain it. My mind kept replaying the motion, the jerky, intelligent path, the pauses, the sudden returns. I checked my phone for satellites, flights, anything. Nothing matched. I even looked up drone sightings in the area. Nothing. The next day I tried to rationalize it. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks. Maybe it was a reflection from the porch light off something in the yard. But every time I thought that, I remembered how fast it had moved. The sudden stops, the way it returned exactly to its original position. No reflection does that. Over the next few nights I went out again, hoping to catch it or see something similar. The sky was clear, the stars steady, nothing out of place. Yet I kept thinking about that one point of light. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the kitchen at night, I glance out the window at the stars, and I swear I see it flicker. Not moving, just a subtle pulse, like it's acknowledging that it's there, watching. I haven't told anyone else about it, not in detail. People would laugh or roll their eyes. Even Mara won't talk about it much. She says she saw it too, but she quickly changes the subject. Maybe we were both tired, seeing things, but I can't convince myself. I go outside sometimes now, looking for that erratic star. I'll stare for hours, tracking satellites and planes, trying to catch it again. I haven't. Yet sometimes, in the middle of a quiet night, I'll swear I see it flash across the sky, impossible, precise, like it never left the first place I saw it. And every time I blink, it's back. I don't know what it was. It wasn't a plane, or a satellite, or a meteor. Nothing I can identify. Just that one point of light, moving in a way that shouldn't be possible, then returning like nothing happened. It leaves me unsettled, the kind of unease that sits in your chest, quiet, persistent. I still watch the sky most nights, hoping maybe I'll catch it again. Maybe it'll move in front of me once more and I'll finally understand. But most of the time, it's just the stars, and that one star, impossibly still, waiting, almost teasing me.